Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, settle in for the story of Carmine, the snake, Persico, the boss who never stepped down. From Brooklyn schoolyards to backroom deals, from the Gallo War to the day the federal government put the commission on trial, he ruled the Colombo family with patience, betrayal, and a grip that tightened even behind steel doors. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? We love seeing this little underworld grow across countries and time zones. Now, take a deep breath, let the noise of the day drift away, and slip into 1986, when the snake dared to defend himself and still pulled strings from the shadows. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. The winter air in Brooklyn could bite through even the thickest coat, but in the cramped apartment over on Carroll Street, warmth came not from a radiator, but from the closeness of family. Carmine John Persico Jr. entered the world on August 8, 1933, the third child of Carmine Sr. and Susan, in a neighborhood where the accent was thick, the loyalties thicker, and survival was a daily skill. His father, a longshoreman with hands like weathered rope, knew the docks as well as he knew the quiet codes of the street. His mother kept the home running with the sharp efficiency of someone who understood that in Brooklyn, money wasn't just earned. It was stretched, hidden, and guarded like gold. The Depression had left scars on the city's soul, and while the Persico family wasn't destitute, they lived in a world where every nickel had weight. Little Carmine, dark-eyed and restless, grew up watching his father navigate the longshoreman's world, one foot in hard, honest labor, the other brushing up against the shadows where dock bosses and mob fixers took their cut. In the kitchen, over coffee that tasted more like survival than comfort, Carmine's parents spoke in low voices, their words clipped, careful. There was always someone listening in Brooklyn. On the streets outside, the rhythm of the borough was a rough symphony. Trolley bells clanging, fruit sellers shouting, radios spilling big band music from open windows. But for boys like Carmine, that music was just background noise to something more magnetic. The sight of older kids in sharp suits leaning against lampposts, flicking cigarette ash, laughing at jokes that didn't need explaining. Those boys weren't playing stickball anymore. They were running errands for men with names everyone knew, but few dared to say out loud. By the time Carmine was 12, the edges of his world had already blurred. He was quick with his fists, quicker with his tongue, and had a knack for reading people, a skill that in Brooklyn was worth more than knowing your ABCs. School felt like a cage to him, each lesson a chain dragging him away from where the real action was. He preferred the street corner classrooms, where the lessons were taught in nods, whispers, and the subtle shifting of eyes. The war years brought change. Brooklyn's docks roared with activity, cargo ships coming and going with the urgency of a city feeding a global conflict. Men were drafted, jobs opened, and the money flowed faster. But so did opportunity for those willing to take what wasn't theirs. For a young Carmine, the war was a reminder that life could change in a heartbeat, and that fortune favored the bold. He carried himself with a confidence beyond his years, the kind that could charm a store clerk or stare down an older kid who thought he could push him around. Somewhere along the way, the Garfield Boys took notice. They weren't the most feared gang in Brooklyn, not yet, but in Carroll Gardens and Gowanus, their name carried weight. They were a crew of teenagers who did more than just hang around street corners. They boosted cars, ran protection on small-time bookmakers, and weren't afraid to throw down if a rival gang crossed into their turf. Carmine didn't just drift into their orbit. He walked in like he belonged there, and within weeks, he did. It started small. A package dropped off here, a message carried there. The Garfield Boys tested him, the way a pack tests a newcomer, watching to see if he'd crack under pressure. He didn't. If anything, he seemed to relish the game, like each errand was a step in a larger plan only he could see. He had a way of speaking that made even older boys lean in to listen, a mix of confidence and calculated understatement. He didn't shout to make a point. He let his silences do the talking. But the streets weren't a playground. Rival gangs lurked in every shadow, and violence could erupt from nothing. A wrong look, a careless word, a line crossed without realizing it. Carmine learned to move like a chess player, thinking 2 steps ahead, reading the board before making a move. When a fight broke out between the Garfield Boys and a rival crew one sweltering summer night, Carmine didn't rush in swinging. He circled, waited, then struck where it hurt most, breaking the nose of the rival's leader with a single, precise punch. The message was clear. He wasn't just another tough kid. He was someone you'd regret underestimating. At home, his parents saw the changes but didn't know how deep they went. His father believed in discipline, in keeping your head down and working hard. But in the streets, Carmine saw men who worked hard and still had nothing, while others in tailored suits made fortunes without lifting anything heavier than a phone receiver. Respect didn't come from a punch clock. It came from fear, loyalty, and control. By 15, Carmine's schooling had all but ended. Officially, he dropped out. Unofficially, the streets had claimed him. The Garfield Boys had become his family outside of blood, a network that taught him how to earn without leaving a paper trail, how to talk his way out of trouble with cops, and, most importantly, how to recognize opportunity when it walked past. Opportunity came in many forms in Brooklyn. Sometimes it was a truck parked a little too far from the curb, its driver grabbing a quick coffee. Sometimes it was a bookmaker looking for muscle to make sure his clients paid on time. Carmine took it all in stride, never too greedy, never too flashy. Flash got you noticed, and in a neighborhood policed as much by the mob as by the city, being noticed could be deadly. The first serious test came in the summer of 1951. Carmine and a few Garfield boys crossed paths with a group from another neighborhood in Prospect Park. Words turned to shoves, shoves to fists, fists to something worse. One boy from the rival group went down and didn't get back up. The police came fast, and the headlines were quick to follow. At just 17, Carmine was arrested for homicide. It could have been the end right there, a lifetime behind bars before his life had even begun. But Brooklyn had a way of bending for those who knew how to navigate it. Witnesses grew uncertain, stories shifted, and by the time the case wound through the system, the charges were dropped. Officially, Carmine walked away clean. Unofficially, he walked away with something far more valuable, a reputation. Word spread that Carmine had kept his cool even in the back of a squad car, that he hadn't ratted on a single friend, and that he'd faced down a homicide charge without flinching. In the underworld, that kind of composure was worth its weight in gold. It marked him not just as a tough kid, but as a man you could trust when things went bad. The Garfield Boys were small time, but in Brooklyn's tangled web of crews, alliances, and family ties, they brushed shoulders with bigger players. One of those was the Profaci crime family, a powerful organization with deep roots in the city's rackets. Men from the Profaci crew had been watching Carmine, not because of the Prospect Park incident alone, but because he had the one thing that couldn't be taught: presence. Presence was subtle. It wasn't about being the loudest in the room or the first to throw a punch. It was about walking into a diner and having people glance up without knowing why. It was about the way a man could make a promise sound like a guarantee and a threat sound like a fact. Carmine had it, and men in the life recognized it like a jeweler spotting a flawless diamond. Still, presence alone didn't open doors. Trust had to be earned. Carmine started running small errands for Profaci associates, a pickup here, a delivery there. He learned to navigate the invisible borders between crews, to spot the unmarked cars that might be trailing him, and to keep his mouth shut unless he had something worth saying. Silence, he realized, could be more powerful than any weapon. He also learned the unspoken rule of the life: never let them see you sweat. Whether it was a cop leaning too hard in an interrogation room or a rival trying to provoke a reaction, Carmine wore the same calm expression. Inside, he might be weighing a dozen outcomes, but on the surface, he was unreadable. That unreadable mask would become his armor in the years ahead. Brooklyn in the late 40s was a city in transition. The war was over, the economy was booming, and yet the streets still belonged to men who enforced their will not with laws, but with fear. For young men like Carmine Persico, this was the proving ground. Every handshake was an alliance, every glare a challenge, and every day a test of whether you could survive not just the violence, but the politics behind it. The Garfield Boys gave him the basics: muscle, hustle, and the beginnings of a network. The Profaci family offered something else: a ladder. But climbing that ladder came with a cost. Once you stepped onto it, there was no going back to being just another kid from Carroll Street. On certain nights, when the air hung thick with the smell of bread from the corner bakery and the streets shimmered under the yellow glow of lamplight, Carmine would walk home alone, his footsteps echoing off brick walls. He was still just a teenager, but the weight on his shoulders was heavier than most men twice his age. Somewhere inside, he knew he was standing at the edge of something, a world that promised respect, money, and power, but demanded absolute loyalty and a willingness to do whatever it took to keep both. He had already learned the first truth of that world: you didn't need to shout to make people listen. Sometimes the most dangerous man in the room was the one who spoke the least. And soon, men far more dangerous than the Garfield Boys would be listening. It was a warm July night, the kind that made Brooklyn feel smaller, like the air itself was closing in. The lamps along the paths of Prospect Park cast long, uneven shadows across the grass, turning the trees into jagged silhouettes. Somewhere, a radio played faint swing music, but here in the park, the sound was swallowed by the murmur of voices, the low hum of tension building between two groups of boys who'd been circling each other all summer. Carmine Persico stood near the edge of the path, 17 years old, hands loose at his sides, eyes scanning every movement like a chess player sizing up the board. He wasn't the biggest in the group, not the loudest, but there was a stillness to him, a kind of coiled readiness that the Garfield Boys had already learned to respect. Tonight, they were walking into someone else's corner, a rival neighborhood crew. Words had been exchanged earlier that week. Insults, slights, maybe even a shove or two. But in Brooklyn, 1951, things like that didn't fade. They grew teeth. The first shout came from the other side of the clearing. The rivals stepped out from the shadow of an elm, their leader smirking like he already knew how this night would end. There was a strange politeness to it at first, boys calling each other out by name, asking questions that were really accusations. "What's this I hear? You think you can just..." It was theater, the way these confrontations always were, but theater with an edge sharp enough to draw blood. No one remembers who threw the first punch. Some say it came from the Garfield side, others swear it was the rival leader himself, a hard right that landed on one of Carmine's friends and snapped the last thread holding the night together. Suddenly the air was filled with grunts, shouts, the dull thud of fists hitting flesh. Feet scraped against the path, bodies slammed into the grass. The fight rolled like a storm cloud, shifting and crashing in pockets of chaos. Carmine moved differently than most. He didn't flail. He didn't throw wild shots. He picked his moment. In the blur of the brawl, he saw the rival leader, bigger, older, moving with the arrogance of someone who'd never lost. Carmine closed the distance fast. A shove to the chest broke the man's balance. A hard punch followed, then another. Witnesses later said it was like watching someone methodically dismantle a machine. Each hit calculated, each move deliberate. Then came the moment no one could take back. The rival went down hard, head striking the ground with a sickening finality. For a second, the fight seemed to pause. The Garfield Boys looked down at him. He didn't move. Someone muttered a curse. And just like that, reality bled in around the edges of the adrenaline. Sirens in Brooklyn always seemed to echo before they arrived. Tonight, that echo felt closer. Carmine and the Garfield Boys scattered in different directions, but the park was a maze of paths and open spaces. The cops came in pairs, flashlights cutting through the darkness, voices barking commands. Carmine didn't run far before a flashlight beam locked on him. "Stop right there." The voice was heavy with authority, but also with the satisfaction of a catch. Two officers closed in, one grabbing his arm, the other shoving him forward. Carmine didn't resist, didn't spit, didn't shout. He kept his mouth shut, his eyes steady, as they walked him toward the waiting squad car. Inside, the smell of vinyl and cigarettes pressed against him. Down at the station, the questioning began. The detectives weren't new to this game. They knew how to push, how to prod, how to make a 17-year-old feel small without ever raising a hand. They painted the scene for him in words: a boy lying unconscious, maybe dead. Witnesses pointing fingers. The Garfield boys already spilling their guts. It was the kind of interrogation designed to make someone panic. But Carmine didn't bite. He'd grown up listening to men talk around things rather than about them. He knew silence wasn't just the absence of speech. It was a tool, a shield. Every time a detective tried to pin him down, he let the question hang in the air until it lost its sting. When he spoke, it was to say he didn't know. He wasn't there. They must have the wrong guy. His voice never wavered. Word of the arrest traveled faster than the paperwork. By morning, men on the docks were already talking about the Persico kid who'd been picked up for killing a rival in Prospect Park. In the neighborhoods, the story took on its own life. Some said Carmine had taken on 3 guys by himself. Others whispered that the cops were railroading him because they couldn't get to his father. In a place like Brooklyn, truth was just one version of events among many. The boy in the hospital didn't make it. That much was fact. But the rest? It became foggy fast. Witnesses began to forget. Stories shifted. Faces blurred. Some swore they couldn't tell who'd thrown the punches in the dark. Others claimed they'd been too far away. Without clear testimony, the case started to look shaky. Still, the weight of a homicide charge is heavy, even for a kid who'd grown up in the shadow of tougher men. Carmine spent weeks waiting, never knowing if the next day would be the one that locked him away for life. Nights in the holding cell were long, filled with the sound of other men shifting in their bunks, muttering in their sleep, or just staring into the dark. But even here, he never lost his calm. That calmness, that unreadable stillness, was noticed. When the charges were dropped, it wasn't because the cops had decided he was innocent. It was because the case had fallen apart. Without solid witnesses, without a confession, they had nothing they could take to a jury. Carmine walked out of the courthouse into the summer light, free but marked. On the streets, being arrested for murder and walking away clean was a kind of baptism. It told people you could keep your mouth shut under pressure, that you wouldn't break when the heat came down. For some, it made you dangerous. For others, it made you valuable. The Garfield boys treated him differently now. He wasn't just another kid in the crew. He was someone with a story, someone who'd been tested and hadn't cracked. Older men started taking notice too. Men from outside the Garfield circle, men whose names were spoken in quiet tones over espresso at the back of neighborhood cafes. Carmine didn't boast about what had happened. He didn't have to. In Brooklyn, silence carried its own kind of volume. People filled in the blanks on their own, and the blanks were always worse than the truth. That was the beginning of the myth, the idea that he was a snake, quiet until he struck, and when he did, it was precise, final. But myths don't grow without reason. Behind the calm expression, behind the measured steps, Carmine was already thinking about what came next. The park fight had shown him 2 things. First, that he could hold his own when it mattered, and second, that the rules of the street were very different from the rules of the law. In the street, loyalty was currency. Reputation was armor. And fear could be a crown if you wore it right. The detectives who'd questioned him didn't forget his face. Neither did the rival crew. And somewhere, in the back rooms of Brooklyn's social clubs, men with power were weighing whether this 17-year-old could be shaped into something more. For Carmine, it wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. And the when was coming faster than anyone realized. The summer streets of Brooklyn had their own way of deciding who belonged where. By the early 1950s, Carmine Persico had already stepped beyond the borders of teenage mischief. The Garfield boys gave him a taste of the action, quick money from stolen cars, the thrill of running errands that no one could talk about in front of their mothers. But he was restless. Carmine wasn't looking to be just another corner soldier. He wanted in on something bigger, something with structure, rules, and reach. The Profaci crime family was that something. One of the 5 families that made up the beating heart of New York's underworld. The Profacis ran their rackets like a corporation draped in shadows. They controlled parts of the docks, gambling dens, loan shark routes, and all the quiet corners where deals were made. Their name wasn't spoken loudly in public, but its weight was felt everywhere. in the way disputes disappeared overnight, in the way certain men could walk into a neighborhood and change the temperature of the room. For a young man like Carmine, recruitment didn't happen with a handshake and a contract. It happened through whispers, through men who watched you from a distance before ever saying a word. His introduction came through older Garfield boys who'd done side work for Profaci associates, picking up envelopes, moving merchandise, leaning on small-time gamblers who'd fallen behind on payments. Carmine's composure after the Prospect Park arrest had caught the right eyes. Word was, he didn't scare easy and he didn't talk when it mattered. That was currency in the life. One night, over coffee at a Carroll Gardens cafe where the clink of cups masked the weight of conversations, a man named Salvatore Sally Petrazzolo sat across from Carmine. Sally wasn't a big name outside the life, but in the Profaci orbit, he was trusted muscle, a man who handled problems without leaving echoes. He studied Carmine the way a jeweler studies a stone, turning him over in conversation, looking for flaws. "You keep your head down when it counts?" Sally asked, not smiling. Carmine sipped his coffee before answering. "I keep my head where it needs to be." It wasn't the answer itself, but the way he said it. Even, measured, no rush to fill the silence. Sally nodded once. The next week, Carmine was moving packages for the Profaci crew. His first jobs were the kind no one talked about, but everyone understood. A night's work might mean collecting the VIG, the interest payments on a loan shark deal, from a struggling shop owner. The amounts were small at first, but the message was big: pay on time, every time. Sometimes it was running a satchel of cash from a card game in Red Hook to a warehouse in Bensonhurst. Other nights, it meant riding shotgun in a car that just happened to be following a truck full of liquor a little too closely. Hijacking was a Profaci specialty. In a city built on shipping and trucking, the right crew could make a small fortune in a single night without ever stepping into a bank. Carmine learned the mechanics quickly: timing, coordination, and, above all, calm. If the driver thought you were jittery, he might do something stupid. If you looked like you had all the time in the world, he'd hand over the keys without a fight. Gambling, though, was where Carmine saw the real machine at work. The Profacis didn't just run card games, they ran networks. Bookmakers answered to bigger bookmakers, who answered to men higher still, until the profits funneled up like water finding its way to the ocean. Carmine's job was to make sure the flow stayed smooth. That meant settling disputes quietly, keeping players in the game, and making sure no one forgot whose table they were sitting at. In those early years, Carmine wasn't wearing the tailored suits or the gold pinky rings yet. He dressed like any other Brooklyn kid, but his movements were sharper, his silences heavier. The Garfield boys still saw him around, but they knew he was walking in a different world now. The rules had changed. In the gang, loyalty was to your friends. In the family, loyalty was to the organization, and breaking it wasn't just frowned upon, it was fatal. He understood the ladder he was climbing. Every job done well was a wrong. Every quiet nod from a capo was a signal he was moving in the right direction. He didn't rush it. The streets were full of men who'd run too fast toward power and ended up face down in an alley. Carmine's approach was patient, surgical. At night, in the small hours when the city's noise dipped low, he'd think about where this road might lead. He wasn't naive. He knew the life was dangerous, that one bad move could end it. But the promise of control, of being the man people answered to instead of the one answering, was too strong to ignore. The Profaci family had just pulled a quiet talent into their ranks. And soon enough, Brooklyn would see that this quiet talent could strike louder than anyone expected. The morning of October 25, 1957, broke gray over Manhattan, but inside the Park Sheraton Hotel's barbershop, the light was warm and easy. Albert Anastasia, the feared boss of the Gambino family, the man once called the Lord High Executioner for his role in Murder Incorporated, reclined in a leather chair, a hot towel draped across his face. He had lived his life without fear, a man who'd survived the underworld's constant betrayals, its sudden storms of violence. But that morning, he didn't see the shadow moving toward him. The door opened. Two men in trench coats stepped inside, their hats low, the smell of cold air following them. No hesitation, no wasted movement. They were there to work. One shoved the barber aside. The other raised a pistol. The towel slipped from Anastasia's face just in time for him to see the flash of the first shot. He lurched forward, the chair tipping, his last reflex a fighter's instinct to turn toward the attack. But it was too late. Bullets tore through him, sending his body crumpling to the floor in a tangle of blood and linen. In under 10 seconds, the gunmen were gone, swallowed by Midtown's hum as if they'd never been there. The hit shocked the city, even in a time when mafia killings weren't exactly rare. Anastasia wasn't just another mob boss. He was a symbol of raw power, a man whose very name was enough to keep soldiers in line and enemies at bay. Taking him out was more than a power move. It was a seismic event, the kind that rewrote the hierarchy overnight. In the aftermath, rumors spread faster than the ink on the front pages. Who had the nerve to order it? Who had the skill to pull it off? Law enforcement sources whispered about rival bosses, about shifting alliances. On the street, one name kept surfacing in the low, careful conversations between made men and trusted associates: Carmine Persico. The truth was murky, as it always was in the life. There was no arrest, no eyewitness who could make the identification stick. But the whispers were enough to start reshaping Persico's reputation. He was only 24, still a rising figure in the Profaci family, but already known for being efficient, disciplined, and, most importantly, loyal to the men above him. If he had been involved, even as a wheelman or backup, it meant someone at the very top trusted him with a job that could ignite a war. From Persico's perspective, the alleged connection to the Anastasia hit was a double-edged blade. On one side, it elevated him. Men who'd seen him as just another sharp Brooklyn operator now looked at him with a new kind of respect, the respect born from fear. On the other side, it painted a target on his back. In the Mafia, being known as a killer could get you promoted, but it could just as easily get you killed. Those closest to him noticed a shift in how he carried himself afterward. He was still the same in his habits, careful, controlled, never rushing into trouble. But there was a new weight in his silences, a sharper edge in his stare. He didn't speak about the Anastasia job, not even to the men who would have taken a bullet for him. In the life, the fastest way to prove your guilt was to deny it too loudly. So Carmine simply let the rumors breathe. Within the Profaci family, his standing rose. Trusted with bigger envelopes, invited to meetings that had once been closed to him, he found himself brushing shoulders with higher-ranking captains. The old-timers saw the value in a young man who could keep his mouth shut and his hands steady. And if the rumors of his involvement in Anastasia's death helped tighten his grip on the rungs of the ladder, no one was about to challenge it. For law enforcement, the whispers around Persico were frustrating, another lead they couldn't pin down. Detectives kept his name in their notebooks, circling it alongside others connected to the Profaci crew. But without witnesses, without a mistake, it was just ink on paper. In the backrooms of Brooklyn's cafes and social clubs, however, the story was different. There, the tale of Carmine's supposed role in the Park Sheraton hit became part of his myth. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. In the life, perception could be as powerful as fact. And the perception was clear. Carmine Persico was no longer just an ambitious kid from Carroll Street. He was a man you didn't cross lightly. He had stepped into a new league, and once you played at that level, there was no going back. The streets had a way of remembering, and the name, Persico, was beginning to carry the kind of weight that would echo for decades. And in the shadows of the Profaci family, bigger plays were already in motion, ones that would soon put Carmine's loyalty, cunning, and capacity for betrayal to their ultimate test. Brooklyn had always been a city of neighborhoods, and in the late 1950s, the Profaci crime family controlled more than just street corners. They controlled a network. From the loading docks in Red Hook to the numbers runners in East New York, every racket ran like a spoke on a wheel, and at the hub sat Joseph Profaci. He wasn't the kind of boss who swaggered or bragged. Profaci moved like a man who knew his position was ordained, by age, by respect, by the old Sicilian codes. To outsiders, he looked like a pillar of stability, the head of a family where everyone knew their place. But under the surface, the wheel was beginning to wobble. The trouble came from within, and it came with a name that would soon be known far beyond Brooklyn: the Gallo brothers. Larry, Joey, and Albert. They were cut from a rougher cloth, younger, sharper, and more willing to gamble with their lives if the payoff was right. The Gallos didn't just operate rackets, they branded themselves. They dressed loud, talked louder, and built an aura that drew young toughs like moths to a flame. They also produced results. The Gallo crew pulled in big money through hijackings, high-stakes gambling, and loan sharking. They were the kind of earners every boss needed, but they were also the kind that kept bosses up at night. They liked the spotlight too much, and they didn't mind stepping on toes. In the old-school world of men like Profaci, where business was meant to be discreet, the Gallos were a problem that success couldn't disguise forever. For years, the tension simmered. The Gallos were loyal enough to keep the peace, but underneath, they were taking mental notes, watching the way money flowed up the chain, watching who got rewarded and who got crumbs. The more they earned, the more they began to feel cheated. They risked the most on the streets, yet the lion's share seemed to end up in the pockets of older captains who rarely got their hands dirty. In the Mafia, you didn't keep score out loud, but the Gallos were keeping score all the same. Carmine Persico was in an unusual position. By now, he'd been moving steadily upward in the Profaci family. He was known for keeping his mouth shut and his eyes open, for handling trouble with a cold patience that older men valued. He'd worked alongside the Gallos on certain jobs and gotten along well with them. They admired his nerve, his calm, the way he didn't rush headfirst into a problem but also didn't back down when things turned violent. To the Gallos, Persico was someone worth having on their side if things ever went bad. And things were about to go bad. The spark came in 1959, when Profaci ordered the killing of Frankie Shots Abadamarco. Frankie was a high-volume earner in the numbers racket, a man who'd been paying the family for years. But he'd fallen behind on payments to the boss, and in Profaci's world, debts were settled permanently. The hit was carried out quickly, decisively. And while it may have made financial sense to Profaci, it was personal to the Gallos. Frankie had been a friend and, in many ways, a political ally. His death wasn't just business, it was a slap in the face. From that moment, the Gallos began to turn. They stopped talking about profits and started talking about power. They wanted better rackets, bigger cuts, and more autonomy from Profaci's tight grip. And they weren't going to ask politely. In an unprecedented move, the Gallo crew kidnapped 5 senior members of the Profaci family, including underboss Joseph Magliocco. They held them in secret locations around the city, treating them well enough to keep them alive, but making their message clear. These men would not be released until Profaci met their demands. The demands were bold, more lucrative territory, an end to what they called tribute extortion from the boss, and guarantees that their crew would be treated as equals in the family hierarchy. It was the kind of open defiance that shook the underworld. No one kidnapped a boss's men without knowing it could mean all-out war. In the neighborhoods, the mood shifted overnight. Social clubs buzzed with speculation. Would Profaci give in, or would he send soldiers to wipe the Gallos off the map? Old-timers shook their heads, muttering that nothing like this had happened since the Castellamaries were 30 years earlier. The younger guys, the street toughs looking for a shot at something bigger, whispered that maybe the Gallos were the future. Persico moved carefully during these weeks. The Gallos treated him like a friend, assuming he'd stand with them if push came to shove. Profaci's loyalists saw him as a valuable soldier who could be trusted to help crush the rebellion when the time came. He was caught between two currents, each one capable of dragging him under. The wrong word to the wrong man could mean a bullet in the night. Behind closed doors, Profaci was seething. Publicly, he began to negotiate with the Gallos, agreeing to some of their terms to secure the release of his men. But in the Mafia, a deal made under duress is just the first step in setting up a double cross. The Gallos may have thought they'd won a victory, but older, wiser men knew that Profaci was biding his time. The truce, when it came, was fragile and false. On the streets, soldiers on both sides began carrying themselves differently. Eyes lingered longer. Conversations dropped to whispers when certain names came up. In the cafes of Brooklyn, you could feel the temperature changing. Everyone knew the shooting hadn't started yet, but it would. Carmine Persico saw all of it. He watched the gallows push harder, watched Profaci plot in silence, and began thinking about where he would stand when the first shot was fired. For all their charm and ambition, the gallows were making enemies faster than they were securing allies. And Persico, patient as ever, understood that in the Mafia, survival wasn't just about who you fought for. It was about knowing when to turn and who to turn on. Soon, that choice would come. And when Carmine made it, it wouldn't just decide the outcome of the Profaci-Gallo feud. It would define his name for the rest of his life, a name that would become a warning whispered across the underworld, the Snake. It was the kind of night that tricks you into thinking the worst might be over. The air in Brooklyn had a brittle chill, but the streets were calm. Too calm for a city holding its breath. The Gallo-Profaci feud had been dragging on for months, an uneasy truce patched together with promises everyone knew were lies. Carmine Persico moved through it like a man walking a tightrope, one foot in the Gallo camp, the other in Profaci's circle. To the gallows, he was still a friend, a reliable earner, someone who'd fought beside them when it mattered. To Profaci's loyalists, he was a man smart enough to infiltrate the rebels and bring back valuable whispers. Neither side suspected just how far Persico was willing to take the act. Joey Gallo, the youngest and most volatile of the brothers, had a reputation for charisma and cruelty in equal measure. He could charm you over a plate of spaghetti, then order your death before the coffee cooled. Persico knew Joey's pride was both his engine and his weakness. If you could get close enough to him, you could cut the engine. That closeness was easy to maintain. Joey liked Persico, trusted him, even. They'd shared war stories, late-night laughs, intense stakeouts where you learn exactly how a man handles fear. Persico let the trust grow, never tipping his hand. But behind the calm expression, he was already playing the endgame. Profaci wanted the gallows broken, and Persico had decided he was the one to do it. The moment came in 1961, in the cramped back room of a Brooklyn club where the walls smelled of sweat, cigars, and spilled whiskey. It was late, the kind of hour when most of the city was asleep, and Joey was half in his cups, leaning back in his chair. The room was quiet except for the low hum of conversation and the occasional clink of glass. Persico sat close, just another night between friends. Then, without warning, he moved. Quick, silent, lethal. His hands shot up, looping a length of cord around Joey's throat. The chair scraped against the floor as Joey jerked forward, his eyes wide in shock more than fear at first. The air filled with a muffled struggle, Joey's boots kicking against the floorboards, Persico's grip tightening with calculated precision. Strangulation is personal, intimate. You have to be close enough to see the life drain from a man's eyes. Persico didn't flinch, but Joey Gallo was a street fighter to his core. He twisted hard, knocking the chair sideways, breaking the rhythm of the attack. The commotion brought others rushing in. The cord slipped, Joey gasped for air, his face flushed with rage and disbelief. The room exploded with shouting, hands pulling the two men apart. Joey survived, but the damage was done. Not just to his throat, but to the fragile trust that had once defined the Gallo-Persico connection. In that single act, Carmine had declared himself. The Gallos saw it as a betrayal of the deepest kind. Profaci's loyalists saw it as a masterstroke, a surgical strike from inside the enemy's circle. It was around this time that Persico began to carry a new name on the streets. The Snake. It wasn't meant as an insult, at least not in Profaci's world. It was a nod to his style, silent, patient, striking without warning, and leaving his mark so deep it was never forgotten. The nickname spread fast, whispered in bars, repeated in social clubs, muttered in police precincts by detectives who knew they were dealing with someone dangerous. For Persico, the attack on Joey Gallo was more than just an assassination attempt. It was his coming-out moment, the move that proved he could play both sides until the exact second he decided to pick one, and then make the decision with deadly clarity. It solidified his place in Profaci's inner circle and marked him as a man who understood the oldest rule in the Mafia. The winner isn't the one with the most allies. It's the one who knows when to turn his blade inward. But betrayal in the underworld is never a closed chapter. Joey Gallo is still breathing, still plotting, and still very much a threat. And Carmine Persico, now the Snake, had just painted a target on his own back, one that would follow him into the next and bloodiest phase of the war. Brooklyn in the early 1960s wasn't just tense. It was electric, like a live wire humming under the pavement. Every corner felt watched, every doorway a potential ambush. The uneasy truce between the Gallos and the Profaci loyalists had finally snapped, and when it did, it tore the family in two. What had begun as a power dispute had turned into a full-scale mob civil war, the kind that spilled blood not just in dark alleys, but in broad daylight, where everyone could see. The Gallos, humiliated by Profaci's stalling on their demands and enraged over betrayals like the attempted strangulation of Joey Gallo, declared themselves at war. They were younger, hungrier, and far more willing to turn Brooklyn into a battleground. Profaci's camp, older, more conservative, but no less deadly, responded in kind. The streets were now divided, and anyone who chose a side was automatically choosing enemies. Carmine Persico, freshly christened the Snake after his turn on Joey Gallo, had committed himself fully to the Profaci side. That made him a marked man. The Gallos wanted him not just dead, but erased, a warning to anyone else who might think about crossing them. From the moment war broke out, Persico's movements became calculated to the minute. He switched cars often, avoided predictable routines, and kept his closest circle small enough to count on one hand. In the Mafia, paranoia isn't a weakness, it's insurance. The war didn't take long to get bloody. In August 1961, the Gallos struck first, ambushing Profaci loyalist captains in parking lots and outside social clubs. Profaci's soldiers retaliated in kind, drive-bys, shootings in stairwells, disappearances where the body was never found. What set this war apart was the lack of subtlety. There were no careful hits in isolated spots. This was public, meant to send messages. The neighborhoods of Brooklyn became a chessboard, and each hit was a move toward checkmate. Persico's own brush with death came one night as he stepped out of a Bensonhurst restaurant. The street was quiet, a light rain darkening the pavement. He'd taken only a few steps toward his car when the muzzle flash lit the night. The first bullet missed him by inches, shattering the windshield. The second clipped his shoulder, spinning him sideways. Instinct took over. He dove behind a parked car as more rounds tore into the street, the shots echoing off the brick facades. By the time his own men returned fire, the shooters were gone, shadows melting into the night. Wounded but alive, Persico treated the near miss like a lesson. If the Gallos wanted him dead this badly, it meant he was hitting them where it hurt. And if they were willing to take chances in the open, he needed to stay one step ahead. He doubled his caution, but he also sharpened his offense. War in the Mafia wasn't about overwhelming force. It was about patience, precision, and making every shot count. The Gallos, for all their ferocity, began to feel the strain. Profaci's network ran deep, with allies in other boroughs and even other families. Supply lines of money and muscle kept his loyalists armed and ready, while the Gallos had to rely on a smaller, tighter crew. The constant fighting bled their resources and frayed their alliances. By 1962, the conflict reached a stalemate. Profaci himself died of cancer that year, passing the reins to Joseph Magliocco. For a brief moment, there was hope that new leadership might bring peace. But peace in this war was an illusion. The grudges were too deep, the score too unsettled. Skirmishes continued, and Persico kept his place at the center, orchestrating hits, negotiating alliances, and watching for the next move from an enemy that refused to disappear. When the dust finally began to settle in 1963, it wasn't because either side had truly won. The Gallos were weakened, their power diminished, but they were far from gone. The Profaci family had survived, but it was now a family with deep fractures, cracks that could be exploited in the years to come. For Carmine Persico, the war had been more than survival. It had been a proving ground. He had taken bullets and kept moving. He had learned how to command men in chaos, how to read an enemy's next move, and how to turn patience into a weapon. In the shadows of the First Colombo War, the snake had coiled tighter, ready for the next strike. And it would come from a direction no one in the family was prepared for. The clang of the iron door closing behind him should have felt like the end. For most men in the life, prison was a pause button, a cold, gray purgatory where ambition went to die and your name faded from the streets. But for Carmine Persico, prison in the early 1960s wasn't the end of anything. If anything, it was the start of something bigger. He'd gone in with a reputation, the snake, the man who had turned on the gallows and survived a mob civil war. That name carried weight, even inside. The other inmates knew his story. Some had fought alongside him. Others had fought against him. But all of them understood one thing. Persico had a knack for survival that bordered on the uncanny. From the outside, the Profaci family was changing. Joseph Profaci's death in 1962 had left a power vacuum. Joseph Magliocco, his underboss, stepped into the boss's seat, but it was a shaky move. Magliocco didn't have the same iron grip as Profaci and the other New York families, especially Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese, were watching closely. Behind the scenes, deals were being whispered, alliances shifted. In prison, Persico didn't have a crew to run in the streets, not directly. But what he did have was influence. Mob politics don't stop at the prison gates. Information flows in and out like contraband. And in an era before wiretaps could track every whisper, a well-placed letter or a quiet conversation in the visiting room could move pieces on the board. Persico kept his lines open to the outside, passing word through trusted visitors and lawyers. Magliocco and his consigliere, Salvatore Sally Musacchia, knew Persico was valuable. Even locked up, he commanded respect among soldiers and associates on the street. He'd proven himself as both a fighter and a strategist during the First Colombo War. So when the time came to reorganize in the wake of Profaci's death, Magliocco made a surprising move. He promoted Carmine Persico to capo. It was an unusual decision, even in the Mafia. A capo was a field commander, a man expected to run crews, collect money, settle disputes, and Persico was doing it from behind bars. But the promotion sent a message. Loyalty to the family would be rewarded, no matter the circumstances. It also gave Persico something even more valuable than money, legitimacy. He wasn't just a soldier with a reputation anymore. He was part of the upper tier, a man whose name carried authority in sit-downs and whose word could settle arguments without a single shot being fired. Inside, Persico operated with the same patience he'd shown on the streets. He brokered deals between inmates tied to different families, kept his ear to the ground for news from the outside, and made sure his crew was still earning. His orders went out in coded messages, never anything incriminating, but always enough to keep the gears turning. Some inmates watched him closely, trying to figure out how a man could climb the ladder while locked in a cell. But Persico never explained himself. In the Mafia, explaining his weakness. All anyone needed to know was that the snake still had fangs, and his bite could reach far beyond the prison walls. When his release date approached, Persico wasn't coming out as just another street-level operator. He was coming out with a crew, a title, and a direct seat at the table. Prison hadn't slowed his rise, it had cemented it. And on the streets of Brooklyn, where old grudges still simmered and new opportunities were waiting, Carmine Persico was about to step back into a city that had changed, but not enough to forget his name. The rain had stopped, but the streets of Brooklyn still glistened, slick and black under the yellow haze of the street lamps. In the distance, a truck engine rumbled low, its headlights cutting through the damp air. Two men leaned against a parked car, coats turned up, cigarettes glowing faint in the dark. They weren't waiting for the truck. They were waiting for the signal. And when it came, a single blink from a third man standing half a block away, they moved like clockwork. One slid into the truck's cab, pressing a pistol into the startled driver's ribs, the other swinging the back door open to reveal crates stacked high. By the time anyone thought to call the police, the truck would be stripped bare, its cargo dispersed to warehouses scattered across 3 boroughs. Another quiet payday for Carmine Persico's crew. By the mid-1960s, Carmine the Snake Persico was no longer just a soldier who had survived the Colombo family's bloody civil war. He was a capo, and in New York's underworld, that meant more than rank. It meant territory. It meant soldiers. It meant responsibility and opportunity. His rise had been swift, almost unnervingly so for a man still in his early 30s, and he understood the unspoken truth. The title was only worth what you could make it earn. He built his crew like a craftsman builds a watch, every part placed with care, every man chosen for what he brought to the table. Some were muscle, the kind who could collect a debt without ever throwing a punch, their presence alone enough to make a debtor's hands shake. Others were operators, men who knew the back doors of warehouses, the shipping schedules at the docks, the names of truckers who could be persuaded to look the other way. And then there were the earner types, gamblers, bookmakers, and loan sharks who could turn street corners into gold mines. Extortion was the foundation. Persico's crew didn't waste time chasing small bills. They targeted steady income, dock foremen, grocery wholesalers, neighborhood bars. Protection wasn't a shakedown with a baseball bat. It was an insurance policy no legitimate company could offer. Pay the weekly envelope, and nothing bad happened. No vandalized storefronts. No mysterious fires. No union troubles. Persico made sure it ran smooth. And when someone thought they could save a few bucks by skipping payment, the correction was immediate and unmistakable. A brick through the window, a late-night visit, or in extreme cases, a man waking up in the hospital with his jaw wired shut. Hijacking, though, that was where the real money lived. In an age when goods traveled by truck more than plane, a single heist could bankroll the crew for weeks. Persico's men studied routes like generals studying a battlefield, knowing which streets were dimly lit, which police patrols could be predicted down to the minute. The job itself was quick: intercept, neutralize, disappear. The driver would be left shaken but alive. Killing was bad for business unless it was necessary. The stolen cargo, whether it was crates of liquor, boxes of new appliances, or luxury fabrics, would be moved to secure locations and broken down into smaller shipments. Within 48 hours, it would be impossible to trace. But in the Mafia, violence was never far from business. There were always disputes, a bookmaker stepping on another man's territory, a loan shark charging rates that cut into the family's take, a rival crew testing the boundaries. Persico wasn't reckless with murder. He treated it like a scalpel, not a hammer. If someone had to go, it was done clean, without noise, and in a way that made the message unmistakable. This was what happened when you crossed the snake. The men who worked for him didn't just fear him, they admired him. Persico paid well and treated loyalty like a rare currency. If a soldier went down on a job, Carmine made sure his family was taken care of. If a man proved himself, he got more responsibility, more earning potential. He knew how to keep morale high while keeping discipline tighter than a noose. From the outside, his operations looked effortless, but they were anything but. Persico kept a mental ledger of every moving part. He knew which bar owners were behind, which union guys needed a push, which truck routes were due for a detour. He rotated jobs among his men so no one could be tied to a pattern. Even law enforcement grudgingly admitted his crew was disciplined. Detectives working organized crime in Brooklyn had stacks of case files, but rarely anything solid enough to pin directly to him. Detective Frank McGowan of the NYPD's Organized Crime Bureau would later recall, Persico was a ghost. We knew what his crew was doing. Hell, half the time we'd get tipped off before the jobs were finished. But by the time we got there, there'd be nothing left but tire tracks. He made it so he was always 2 steps removed from the dirt. If you wanted him, you had to hope someone in his crew talked. And nobody talked. His influence stretched beyond the borough. In sit-downs, Persico's opinion began to carry the kind of weight usually reserved for older, more seasoned capos. He could settle disputes between crews without raising his voice, his calm demeanor disarming even the most hot-headed captains. It wasn't charisma in the usual sense. It was the quiet authority of a man who'd already proven, more than once, that he could outthink and outlast anyone who tried to move against him. What made Persico dangerous wasn't just his business acumen, it was his patience. In the streets, young men wanted everything fast. Fast money, fast cars, fast respect. But Persico played the long game. If someone crossed him, he didn't always strike immediately. Sometimes he'd wait months, even years, until the timing was perfect and the blow landed so hard the man never saw it coming. This was how the snake earned his name twice over, not just for betrayal, but for the way he could coil around a situation until it was his alone to control. Still, success had its cost. The more money his crew generated, the more attention it attracted, not just from the police, but from inside the family. In the Mafia, envy was as dangerous as a rival crew's bullets. There were men in the Colombo family who watched Persico's rise with narrowed eyes, wondering how a man so young had climbed so far so fast. And while they might have smiled in meetings, Persico knew enough to never turn his back on them. His expansion into certain rackets also brought him into contact, and sometimes conflict, with other families. The Genovese, the Gambinos, the Luccheses, all had their hands in similar territories, and all played by rules that could bend or break, depending on who held the advantage. Persico navigated these waters carefully, sometimes cutting deals, sometimes pushing back just enough to defend his turf without sparking a war he couldn't control. On one cold November night, his crew intercepted a truck carrying a shipment of imported scotch bound for an upscale Manhattan distributor. The job went off flawlessly, too flawlessly. The very next day, whispers reached Carmine's ear that the cargo had been promised to a Gambino-connected wholesaler. In the wrong hands, that kind of mistake could ignite a feud. But Persico handled it the way only he could. He arranged a quiet meeting, offered a generous cut of the resale profits, and turned a potential conflict into a cooperative venture. The scotch moved through channels faster than ever, and the Gambino contact left the meeting not just appeased, but impressed. That was Persico's genius. He knew when to be the predator and when to be the diplomat. He could make you think you'd won even as you left with less than you came for. Yet for all his skill, the one thing no mob boss could control was the future. The late 1960s were a time of change in the underworld. Law enforcement was starting to modernize its approach. Wiretaps were becoming more common, and public sentiment against organized crime was building. Even within the Colombo family, the balance of power was shifting. Old alliances were wearing thin, and the next move for the family's leadership would ripple down to every crew, including Persico's. In the dim back rooms where the real decisions were made, Carmine Persico's name was coming up more and more. Some saw him as a rising star who could one day lead the family outright. Others saw him as a threat to be managed or eliminated. Persico knew the look in a man's eye when he was being weighed like that. It was the same look he'd given others before striking. On the streets, his empire was humming, money flowing like an underground river. But deep in his gut, the snake could feel it. The air was shifting again, and with it, the delicate balance he had built. The next move wasn't about keeping what he had. It was about surviving the storm he knew was coming. The diesel engine's growl echoed under the low overpass, the kind of hollow sound that made a man's pulse quicken when he knew what was coming. It was a late summer night in 1971, and the air along the highway carried the heavy scent of oil and exhaust. A tractor-trailer loaded with high-end textiles rolled toward its destination, the driver none the wiser that his route had already been mapped, timed, and marked by men who didn't believe in coincidence. Two cars moved into position. One eased in front of the truck, slowing just enough to force the driver to tap his brakes. The other slid up alongside, keeping him boxed in. The lead car's passenger leaned out just enough for the driver to see the pistol in his hand. No words. No shouting. Just a look. The kind that told the driver there were only two choices here: cooperate or risk becoming a headline. The job went off with precision. The truck vanished from its planned route, replaced hours later by an empty rig found on a quiet street. The cargo, worth thousands, was gone before the driver had finished giving his statement to the cops. It was the kind of hit that had Carmine Persico's fingerprints all over it. Not literally, but in the way it was planned like a military operation. Quick, clean, controlled. But even the smoothest jobs leave ripples. Investigators had been circling Persico for years, tracking hijackings across Brooklyn and beyond. This time, the trail didn't go cold fast enough. Informants whispered. Surveillance caught familiar faces in the wrong places. Slowly, the noose tightened, until in 1972, federal prosecutors had what they needed. Persico was charged in connection with the hijacking, the weight of the case heavy enough to stick. In the courtroom, he was calm, the same calm that had earned him his reputation. He listened to the testimony without blinking, conferred with his attorney in hushed tones, and let the government paint their picture. But the jury saw what they were meant to see, a man deeply embedded in an organized theft operation. The verdict came down guilty. The sentence, 8 years in federal prison. For most men, prison was a pause button. For Persico, it was a shift in location, nothing more. His seat at the table in the Colombo family didn't vanish when the cell door slammed shut. If anything, the conviction only added to his legend. To survive inside and keep your business alive on the outside was a test of true power. Federal prison in the 70s was a world of its own, a grim walled city where alliances mattered as much as they did on the streets. Italians stuck with Italians, the mobsters forming tight-knit cliques that kept order among their own. Persico stepped into that environment like a man taking his usual place in the corner booth of a familiar club. He carried himself the same way he had in Brooklyn, calm, deliberate, always watching. Running a crew from behind bars required more than just loyalty. It required structure. Persico had lieutenants on the outside who understood his signals, men who could read between the lines of an innocent-sounding message passed through a lawyer or a visiting family member. Orders were phrased as casual observations, instructions hidden in talk about checking on certain people or making sure certain things were delivered. The money still flowed. Extortion rackets kept paying out. Hijacking jobs continued with the same precision, and debts were collected without delay. To those on the outside, the snake was as present as ever. Only now, his voice came through in carefully chosen words, and his eyes were replaced by trusted men who knew how to act without overstepping. Inside, Persico built influence. He mediated disputes among inmates tied to different families, kept tensions from boiling over, and offered advice in the kind of low, measured tone that made men lean in to listen. Even prison guards recognized his quiet authority. He didn't need to demand respect, it found him. Still, prison life carried its own dangers. Men who'd lost their power on the streets sometimes tried to reclaim it inside, and jealousy was as poisonous here as anywhere. Persico kept his circle small, but his reach broad. He made sure that any threat was addressed before it had the chance to become a problem. Sometimes that meant a quiet talk in the yard. Other times, it meant a man was transferred to another facility under circumstances that were never fully explained. From the outside, law enforcement was watching with frustration. They knew Persico's crew was still active, still earning, still running jobs with his blessing. But proving the connection between the capo in the federal pen and the soldiers in Brooklyn was another matter. No phone calls on record. No letters with explicit orders. Just a steady hum of business that seemed to operate on instinct, or maybe just on fear of what would happen if it stopped. The Colombo family, meanwhile, was shifting. Old loyalties were tested, new rivalries formed. Being physically absent could have been a death sentence for Persico's position, but his ability to keep money flowing insulated him. In the Mafia, a man who earns for the family, no matter where he is a man worth keeping in power. One story from those years made the rounds later. A neighborhood bar owner had fallen behind on his payments. Normally, such a slip would have been handled by a local enforcer. But the man had history with Persico. They'd grown up in the same neighborhood. Instead of sending muscle, Persico sent a message. Remind him that I remember the old days. But also remind him what happens if I have to remember twice. The bar owner paid in full the next week. By the mid-70s, Persico's prison term was winding down. He had spent years proving that his control was not bound by geography. He'd shown that his influence could cross steel doors and razor wire, that his name could still inspire both loyalty and dread from hundreds of miles away. For his crew, Those years became a blueprint for how to keep a criminal enterprise alive under pressure. But freedom would bring its own challenges. The streets he was returning to were not the same as the ones he'd left. Law enforcement was more aggressive, rival crews more ambitious, and within the Colombo family, the seeds of another internal war were beginning to sprout. As he prepared to walk back through the prison gates and into the open air, Carmine Persico knew the next chapter wouldn't just be about keeping his empire alive. It would be about deciding who would stand beside him and who would be left in the shadows when the snake decided to strike again. The June sun beat down hard on Manhattan, baking the asphalt and shimmering off the steel and glass. In Columbus Circle, the American-Italian Civil Rights League rally was already in full swing. Thousands of people had crowded in, men in pressed summer suits, women in bright dresses, kids waving little flags. On the stage, banners fluttered, microphones hummed, and at the center of it all was Joseph Colombo, the boss of the Colombo crime family, now dressed in the skin of a public crusader. Colombo wasn't hiding in the shadows like most mob bosses. He'd put himself front and center, railing against what he called the FBI's harassment of Italian Americans. It was a bold gamble, one part genuine cause, one part calculated PR to cast himself as a folk hero and, maybe, untouchable. The League rallies had become his personal stage, and every one of them was another thumb in the eye of law enforcement. But in the world Joseph Colombo lived in, a stage was also a sniper's perch waiting to be used. The day had started smooth. Colombo mingled with supporters, shaking hands, smiling for cameras, playing the part. The smell of hot pretzels and sausage carts hung in the air, blending with the distant whine of traffic. The crowd was thick, the kind of cover where anything could hide. And then it happened. A young man, later identified as Jerome Johnson, slipped through the press of people near the stage. He wasn't supposed to be there. No one paid much attention at first. The rallies had a constant churn of photographers and hangers-on. Johnson carried a camera, but inside it was no film. He got close enough to see the lines on Colombo's face, close enough to hear the cheer of the crowd. In one motion, the camera dropped. The gun came up. The first shot cracked through the warm air, turning cheer into confusion. Colombo jerked back. The smile wiped from his face as the bullet tore into his head. Another shot followed, slamming into his neck. People screamed, some ducking, some rushing forward. On the stage, men in suits surged toward the boss, dragging him down, shielding him. The shooter was tackled almost instantly, and in the chaos, someone put a bullet in him too. Johnson died there, sprawled on the pavement, before he could answer a single question. It had taken seconds. In the stillness afterward, you could hear the sound of someone crying. The smell of gunpowder drifted over the crowd. Colombo lay motionless, blood pooling under him, his eyes half closed but not seeing. The ambulance roared away toward Roosevelt Hospital, but everyone who saw him knew the truth. Even if Joseph Colombo survived, the man who had run the family was gone. He'd never speak again, never walk again. The doctors would later call it irreversible brain damage. In the Mafia, that was a kind of death all its own. Theories bloomed like weeds before the blood on the sidewalk had even dried. Some swore it was the FBI, tired of Colombo's grandstanding and looking to take him down without a public trial. Others pointed to internal family politics, rival capos chafing under his leadership, seeing his public crusade as reckless and dangerous. And then there were the whispers that another boss, perhaps Carlo Gambino, had quietly decided Colombo was bringing too much heat on everyone. For Carmine Persico, the shooting was a moment of cold clarity. Colombo's injury had left a vacuum, and vacuums in the Mafia are invitations for blood. Power abhors a void, and the family needed someone to keep it from splintering into open war. Persico wasn't the most senior man, but he was smart, connected, and respected on the street. More importantly, he'd survived enough battles to know how to navigate a storm. In the days after the shooting, the Colombo family went into a kind of controlled lockdown. Crews kept working their rackets, but meetings were quieter, more cautious. Everyone was watching everyone else. Magliocco loyalists, Gallo sympathizers, independent earners, They were all taking each other's temperature, seeing which way the wind might blow. Persico began moving carefully through these currents, making his presence felt without making it look like he was grabbing for the top seat. In conversations, he kept the focus on stability and business as usual. But in the shadows, he was building alliances, reminding men that he'd stood firm in the wars, that he could keep the peace when others might go for broke. The cops saw the shift too. Detective units and FBI agents who'd been shadowing Colombo's movements now turned their attention to the next possible leaders. Persico's name began showing up more often in reports. He'd been a known quantity for years, but now he was seen as someone who could step into a larger role. Still, the Colombo shooting had sent ripples far beyond the family itself. The public had seen a mob boss gunned down in broad daylight, at a rally he'd organized himself. It made headlines around the world, proof that the underworld could spill into the everyday in an instant. For law enforcement, it was a gift, an example they could hold up to show the inherent violence of the Mafia. For rival families, it was a reminder that even the most public figure could be silenced in seconds. Colombo's condition never improved. He lingered for years in a hospital bed, technically alive but removed from the game. And in that strange limbo, the family he'd once ruled became something else entirely, a chessboard where every piece had the potential to betray the king. Persico understood that the next moves would decide everything. The family needed leadership, but too bold a play could unite enemies against him. Too slow, and someone else might seize the moment. The shooting of Joseph Colombo wasn't just the end of one man's reign. It was the opening act of a dangerous, uncertain era. And as the dust from that day's gunfire settled, Carmine Persico was already coiling himself for what came next. The neon glow from Little Italy's narrow streets painted the slick pavement in shades of red and gold. It was the early hours of April 7th, 1972, and the late-night hum of Manhattan had settled into that dangerous quiet where every shadow could hold a surprise. Inside Umberto's clam house, the air was thick with the smell of garlic, wine, and fried calamari. A few tables away from the bar, Joey Gallo sat surrounded by friends and family, laughing in that loud, magnetic way that made people turn their heads. He had just turned 43 earlier that night, celebrating at the Copacabana before deciding to end the evening here, in this cramped seafood joint on Mulberry Street. Gallo, Crazy Joe, had always been a paradox. Charismatic but volatile. A gangster with a taste for the arts, mingling with writers, actors, and civil rights leaders. He dressed sharp, spoke smooth, and carried himself with the kind of swagger that could make a man forget how many bodies were in his wake. But beneath the charm, there was steel and grudges. And one of those grudges had a name, Carmine Persico. Their history was long, tangled with betrayals, assassination attempts, and the bloody chapters of the First Colombo War. The attempted strangulation years earlier had left Joey breathing but never forgiving. The war had cooled, but it had never ended. Not really. Just after 4 in the morning, the clatter of dishes and hum of conversation was broken by the creak of the front door. A man stepped in, his face obscured by the low brim of his cap. He moved quickly but without panic, like someone who had already rehearsed this moment. Witnesses would later disagree about the details, the color of his jacket, whether there was more than one shooter, but everyone agreed on what happened next. The gun came up. The first shot cracked through the small restaurant, freezing everyone in place for half a second before chaos erupted. Joey staggered back, the surprise flashing across his face. More shots followed, echoing off the tiled walls, the smell of cordite cutting through the kitchen aromas. One bullet struck him in the neck, another in the back. His chair toppled as he fell, grabbing for the table in front of him. Plates shattered on the floor, wine spilling across the tiles like blood in miniature. Panic swallowed the room. Diners dove under tables. Joey's wife, Sina, screamed, her voice high and ragged, as she tried to pull him up. He was still breathing, gasping, his eyes locked on nothing. Someone shouted for an ambulance, but the shooter was already gone, swallowed by the city's early morning silence. On the street outside, the hit was over in less than a minute. No grand getaway, no wild chase, just the sound of footsteps fading into the wet darkness. Gallo was rushed to Beekman Downtown Hospital, but the damage was too great. The bullets had done their work. At 5:30 a.m., Joey "Crazy Joe" Gallo was pronounced dead. The news spread fast, rippling through the city before sunrise. In the clubs and cafes of Brooklyn, word was already being whispered. This was no random hit. It was payback, and it carried the stamp of a professional job. To the street, the name behind it was obvious: Carmine Persico. Officially, no one could prove it. There were no fingerprints, no reliable eyewitnesses, no confession. But the logic was simple. Gallo had been a threat, a wild card who had crossed too many lines and too many men. His feud with the Colombo leadership, and with Persico personally, had never truly been resolved. Taking him out wasn't just revenge. It was the removal of a dangerous rival who could have destabilized the family all over again. In the days after the murder, Little Italy was thick with law enforcement. Detectives moved from bar to bar, looking for someone willing to talk. Federal agents quietly listened in on wiretaps, hoping for a brag, a slip, a whisper in the wrong ear. But all they got was silence. Even those who hated Persico understood that this was a move best left unchallenged. For Persico, Gallo's death was more than personal. It was strategic. The Colombo family had been fractured for years, its leadership contested, its loyalties fraying. By removing Gallo, Persico removed the loudest voice of dissent, a man who thrived on chaos and might have sparked another war. In the underworld, stability meant money, and money meant power. And now, the balance tilted more heavily in Persico's favor. The timing was critical. Persico's own legal troubles were mounting. His hijacking conviction was only months away, and he knew his time on the street was running short. Eliminating Gallo before stepping into prison ensured that when he returned, he'd be walking into a family less divided, with one less enemy waiting to settle old scores. The funeral for Joey Gallo was as loud and defiant as the man himself. Dozens of cars followed the hearse, the streets lined with onlookers, some out of respect, others out of morbid curiosity. His coffin was draped in flowers, his legend already growing in the retelling. But in the shadows, those who understood the life knew this wasn't just a goodbye. It was the end of an era. The Gallo crew, without its leader, would splinter, its influence fading with each passing month. In back rooms and whispered conversations, Persico's name rose higher. He was no longer just the snake for his betrayal years earlier. He was now the man who had removed Crazy Joe, who had closed a chapter in the Colombo family's violent history with precision and finality. Still, the streets have long memories. Friends of Gallo, the ones who survived the wars, didn't forget. And while none had the muscle to challenge Persico outright, grudges in the Mafia are like embers. They can sit quiet for years, waiting for the right wind to catch flame. As Carmine Persico prepared for the battles still ahead, with the law, with rivals, even within his own ranks, the night at Umberto's Clam House stood as a reminder of how quickly the game could turn. One moment you're holding court over dinner, the next, you're bleeding out on the tile. And somewhere in the city, the snake was already thinking about the next move. The cold hum of the prison lights never changed. Morning, afternoon, night, it was the same pale glow, the same muted buzz in the concrete corridors. Carmine Persico had been behind these walls for barely a year, serving his sentence on the hijacking conviction. When the news reached him in the most unceremonious way possible, Joseph Colombo was gone from the game for good, and the family needed a boss. Outside, the streets were still finding their rhythm after the chaos of the past few years, the Gallo Wars, the public spectacle of Colombo's rallies, and the shocking moment when the boss was gunned down in front of his followers. Colombo hadn't died immediately, but everyone in the life knew he was never coming back. His body lived, his reign didn't. The family had been running on a patchwork of acting leaders ever since, each one trying to hold together a crew that was equal parts business and grudge. Now, in early 1973, the captains gathered to decide who would wear the crown. It was more than a title. It was control of the rackets, the say in disputes, the right to decide who lived, who earned, and who disappeared. In most families, a man in prison would have been disqualified without a second thought. But this wasn't most families. And Carmine Persico wasn't most men. His reputation was carved into the very history of the Colombos. He had fought in the trenches of the First Colombo War, outlasted Joey Gallo, kept his crew earning even from behind bars. Men respected him, feared him, and, just as importantly, owed him. And in the world of organized crime, debts had a way of influencing votes. The word filtered into the prison yard through the most ordinary channel, a quiet exchange during visiting hours. His cousin leaned forward across the scarred table, his voice low. "They want you in the seat, Carmine." "Boss." "Official." "From in here." Persico didn't react outwardly. That was the way he'd survived his whole life. The less you gave away, the less anyone could use against you. Inside, though, he knew what this meant. Power was one thing. Power without freedom was another. But in the life, perception could matter more than physical presence. If he was boss, it meant he was still the heartbeat of the family, the man whose orders shaped everything from truck hijackings to peace deals with other families. Becoming boss from a prison cell wasn't unprecedented, but it was rare. It required absolute control over your people on the outside. Trust that orders wouldn't be diluted or twisted before they were carried out. Persico already had that structure. His most loyal captains, men like Gennaro Langella and his own brother, Alphonse, were positioned to act as his hands and voice. A simple message could move from his cell to the streets without a single word being written down. The official announcement came quietly, no fanfare, no coronation. Just a phone call to the right men, a handshake in a Brooklyn cafe, a few coded words on the prison payphone. From that moment, Carmine Persico was the boss of the Colombo crime family, boss in name, boss in chains. On the outside, things began to move differently. The captains who might have jostled for position stepped back. For all the temptations of leadership, none of them wanted to cross the snake. His memory for slights was long, and his reach, even from a cell, was longer. Crews tightened their operations, tribute payments flowed in without delay, and disputes were settled in his name. Inside the prison, Persico adjusted to his new role with the same calm efficiency he had shown as a capo. The yard became his office. The mess hall, his conference room. Men came to him for advice, for rulings, for connections to the outside. He didn't pace or strut. He sat still, listening, letting others fill the silence until they revealed exactly what he needed to know. He was careful to keep his authority subtle. In prison, showing your hand too openly could invite trouble from guards or rival inmates. His influence operated like an undertow, invisible on the surface, but strong enough to pull a man wherever Carmine wanted him to go. Guards might see him chatting casually in the yard, but the man leaving that conversation might walk straight into a change in his crew's orders or a reshuffling of their business. Law enforcement took notice. Reports from the organized crime strike force began to list Persico not just as a member, but as boss of the Colombo family. Agents debated how a man in federal custody could run a multi-million-dollar criminal operation. Some called him reckless, others brilliant. One report described him as the most resourceful and dangerous figure in the New York underworld, precisely because he is proving the limits of incarceration. The symbolism of his promotion mattered. In a family scarred by public embarrassment and violent infighting, Persico's ascent represented unity, or at least the appearance of it. The other New York families saw it too. In sit-downs with the commission, the Colombo representative spoke on his behalf, and his word, passed through intermediaries, carried the weight of any free man's. Yet the position came with its own traps. Running a family from behind bars meant trusting that your lieutenants wouldn't start building their own empires in your shadow. Persico was meticulous in keeping them loyal, offering bigger shares of certain rackets, settling disputes in their favor when it counted, and making sure they knew their fortunes were tied to his. Still, he kept backups for his backups. If one man went bad, another was ready to take his place. In the small hours, when the cell block was quiet and the hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound, Persico would think about the streets. The smell of diesel on the docks, the low clink of glasses in the back rooms of Brooklyn cafes. He'd picture the faces of men who, right now, were carrying out his orders, collecting debts, moving shipments, smoothing over disputes. It was a strange kind of power, this ability to shape the outside world while being locked in a box. He also knew it couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, someone would test him. Sooner or later, a rival crew would think they could move in on Colombo territory, figuring the boss was too far away to strike back. When that day came, Persico would have to prove, again, that a prison cell was no barrier to his reach. For now, though, the Colombo family had something it hadn't had in years, a single name at the top. And that name was Carmine Persico. Boss, leader, the snake. But in the world he ruled, peace was never more than a pause between storms. And the next storm was already beginning to form. The winter wind cut through the yard at Lewisburg like a blade, sharp enough to sting the skin and bite at the bones. Carmine Persico stood near the chain-link fence, hands in his coat pockets, eyes scanning the clusters of men scattered across the frozen ground. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for information, the lifeblood of power, even here. Especially here. By the late 1970s, Persico had been the official boss of the Colombo family for years, but his throne was made of concrete and steel. A prison cell was his headquarters, the yard his meeting room, the visiting area his conference table. In the life, most bosses either faded behind bars or watched their empires crumble, swallowed by ambitious underlings. But Persico was different. He didn't just survive prison, he ruled from it. The key was structure. Outside, his loyal captains became his hands and feet. Gennaro Jerry Langella handled day-to-day operations like a chief of staff, smoothing over disputes, greenlighting jobs, and making sure tribute flowed into the right pockets. Other trusted men, including Carmine's own brother, Alphonse, ran the crews, collected the envelopes, and delivered messages. And every message, no matter how small, ultimately led back to the snake. Orders didn't travel by phone calls or letters with neat handwriting. Persico understood that anything recorded was a gift to law enforcement. Instead, instructions moved through layers, coded words in casual conversation, an offhand remark during a lawyer visit, a nod in the prison yard that told a man to check in with someone on the outside. The meaning was never written down. It didn't have to be. His captains had been trained to read between the lines. The system worked because Persico had built it on loyalty and fear in equal measure. Loyalty, because the men closest to him knew he took care of his own. A soldier's family got their cut, whether he was on the street or in a cell. Fear, because everyone also knew what happened to those who tried to outshine him or cut him out. Persico had a long memory and a longer reach. And in the Mafia, a man's reach mattered more than his address. Law enforcement couldn't ignore the fact that, despite his incarceration, the Colombo family was thriving. Rackets and loan sharking, extortion, and gambling kept generating money. The family's slice of construction projects and union deals continued to fatten its coffers. Even hijackings, quick strikes against valuable cargo, still carried that same precision planning Persico had drilled into his crew years earlier. An FBI report from that time captured the frustration plainly. Subject Persico remains the operational head of the Colombo family despite physical confinement. Acting bosses operate at his direction. Power remains centralized. To federal agents, it was maddening. To Persico, it was proof of his skill. Inside, he was more than just a name. Among mob-connected inmates, Persico was a figure of quiet authority. He could mediate disputes between factions with a few carefully chosen words, or tilt the balance of prison power by simply voicing support for one man over another. Inmates without connections tried to get near him, hoping for favors that might carry weight beyond the walls. Those who earned his trust found themselves with better jobs, more protection, and, if they made parole, a potential place in his network outside. Still, running a crime family from prison wasn't without risk. Communication could be slow. A badly relayed order could spiral into a problem on the street. Persico solved this by keeping his inner circle small. Only the most trusted men got direct contact. Everyone else operated through layers, each one insulated from the other, so that if someone flipped or got pinched, they couldn't expose the whole picture. In the outside world, the Colombo family's rivals watched closely. Other bosses respected Persico's ability to keep his house in order, but some saw opportunity in his confinement. The Gambinos, the Lucchese's, even certain factions within the Genovese family, all tested the edges of Colombo territory in small ways. A loan shark working in the wrong neighborhood. A gambling den opening without the proper blessing. Persico responded with precision. No public wars. No messy headlines. A quiet sit-down here, a sudden accident there. The message was simple. The boss might be behind bars, but his authority still had teeth. For his captains, the arrangement was a strange mix of freedom and oversight. They had room to maneuver, to run their operations without constant micromanagement. But they also knew that every major decision, every expansion, every big money deal needed to be cleared. Defying that rule was not an option. Even the law eventually had to admit that Persico's control was intact. Wiretaps caught soldiers talking about going up the line before making moves, a phrase everyone knew meant getting Carmine's word. In one intercepted conversation, a Colombo associate told a gambler, "Don't worry, the boss already knows." Even in there, he knows. But power in the Mafia is never static. Time changes the game. By the late 70s, Persico could sense shifts coming. Younger guys hungry for advancement, old rivalries flaring in small ways, federal prosecutors sharpening their focus on the commission itself. His instincts told him that bigger storms were on the horizon. On the inside, he prepared for them. He built redundancies into his command, grooming multiple men for leadership so no single hit could cripple the family. He strengthened alliances with other bosses through his acting leadership, ensuring that when conflicts came, the Colombos wouldn't stand alone. Outside, Jerry Langella's presence grew. Langella wasn't just holding the fort. He was expanding it, increasing profits, and keeping the peace in a way that mirrored Persico's own style. It reassured the family, but it also gave law enforcement a new target. Federal eyes shifted toward Langella, hoping that if they couldn't get the snake directly, they could weaken his grip by taking down his hands. Persico knew better. He'd been through too many wars to believe his power rested on one man. If Langella fell, another would rise. The structure was the point. The system was the strength. Still, there was no ignoring the fact that each year inside made his position more precarious. Younger capos who had never known him on the street might start to question whether the boss was still the boss. Old friends could turn. Even blood could betray. In the life, loyalty was always conditional, always measured against opportunity. On certain nights, after lockdown, Persico would lie in his bunk, staring at the dark ceiling, replaying conversations from the visiting room, measuring every word for subtext. Was that captain's smile too quick? Did that nod from an old ally mean agreement? Or was it the mask of a man waiting to make his own move? For now, the machine was still running. The money flowed, the family stood together, and Carmine Persico's name still commanded respect in rooms he would never set foot in again. But he could feel it. That subtle change in the air, the quiet restlessness of men who wondered how long a boss could rule from behind bars. The snake knew better than anyone that patience was a weapon. But he also knew that every weapon, if held too long, begins to dull. And far beyond the prison walls, events were already in motion that would force him to sharpen his fangs once again. The rain came down in thin, slanted lines, streaking the windows of the black sedan as it idled outside the Manhattan Federal Courthouse. Carmine Persico sat in the back seat, silent, watching the water distort the streetlights into jagged halos. He was no stranger to courtrooms, but today's case wasn't about violence or hijackings. It was about something quieter, slipperier, a crime of whispers, envelopes, and handshakes behind closed doors. The charge was bribery. Federal prosecutors claimed Persico had tried to pay off an Internal Revenue Service agent, not to erase all his problems, but to make them easier. Less scrutiny, softer questions, maybe even a little blindness to where certain streams of money were flowing. For most men, it might have been a desperate move. For Persico, it was business as usual, an investment in keeping the gears turning. But this time, the investment had gone bad. In the early months of 1981, the FBI had built their case carefully. The agent who took the bribe wasn't just a civil servant. He was a cooperating witness. Conversations were recorded. Meetings were documented. Each quiet exchange, each folded bill, was another nail in the coffin. When the indictment came down, it wasn't just for bribery. It was for conspiracy to influence a federal investigation. The kind of charge that made headlines. Persico understood the game. He knew the evidence was stacked, and he wasn't going to gamble on a jury when the government had him cornered. Instead, he took the route that men in his position sometimes chose, a guilty plea. It wasn't an admission of weakness. It was strategy. By controlling the terms, he could limit the damage, contain the fallout, and keep the bigger parts of his empire insulated. In the courtroom, the air was stale and heavy with the smell of damp coats. Persico stood straight in his tailored suit, the very image of calm. When the judge asked for his plea, his voice didn't waver. "Guilty, Your Honor." A ripple went through the gallery. Reporters scribbling notes, prosecutors exchanging quick glances. This was the boss of the Colombo family, admitting to a federal crime. The sentence came down hard, 5 years in federal prison. It was in addition to the time he was already serving, a fresh block of years stacked onto his confinement. To the average man, that might have been crushing. To Persico, it was just a longer game. Prison hadn't stopped him before, and it wouldn't now. The snake didn't shed his skin because the walls closed in. He simply found a way to keep moving inside them. Back at his cell, he weighed the situation. Another 5 years meant more time to navigate the shifting politics of both the street and the prison yard. It meant relying even more on his acting bosses, Gennaro Langella chief among them, to keep the family stable and profitable. It meant tightening the channels of communication, making sure no loose ends could lead investigators back to him again. The bribery case had exposed something Persico didn't like to admit, that even a boss could be vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with bullets or street wars. The federal government was adapting, learning how to attack the Mafia from the inside out, through financial records, tax audits, and charges that didn't require flipping soldiers or catching a man in the act. Paperwork could be as deadly as a gun. Still, Persico had his advantages. His reputation for control was intact. The captains knew he was still calling the shots. And for every piece of evidence the government had in this bribery case, there were a dozen other operations running so cleanly they couldn't be touched. From the outside, law enforcement tried to paint the guilty plea as a crack in the armor, proof that Persico wasn't untouchable. Inside the life, though, the reaction was different. To many, it showed his ability to take a hit without breaking stride, to accept a loss in one battle while keeping the war firmly in his favor. The months rolled on. Persico's world was reduced again to the measured routines of prison, the early counts, the clatter of meal trays, the echo of footsteps in long corridors. Yet the family's money kept flowing. The union rackets still paid out. Gambling operations continued without interruption. Hijackings, loan sharking, construction kickbacks, all carried on as though the boss was still walking the streets of Brooklyn. Even his enemies had to admit that the bribery sentence hadn't dimmed his influence. If anything, it reinforced his myth. Here was a man who could be caged and still run a criminal organization that spanned boroughs, industries, and entire communities. The government could convict him, but they couldn't dethrone him. Still, there was a nagging truth Persico couldn't ignore. The bribery conviction wasn't just another case. It was a sign that the noose was tightening. The feds were building towards something bigger, something that would go beyond bribery or even racketeering. The whispers in the prison yard and in the visiting room spoke of a coming offensive, a sweeping indictment that could pull in the heads of all 5 families. For Persico, it was a reminder that the real war was no longer just on the streets. It was in courtrooms, in grand jury rooms, in the quiet work of agents and prosecutors who were willing to spend years building a case before making their move. They weren't chasing headlines, they were chasing history. The snake could feel it. Another storm was building, one that would make the bribery case look like a skirmish. And when it hit, it wouldn't just threaten his freedom. It would threaten the very structure of the Mafia in New York. The knock on the cell door came before dawn, sharp and metallic, rattling through the quiet like a warning shot. Carmine Persico sat up slowly on his cot, his eyes adjusting to the pale light bleeding through the narrow window. The guard's voice was flat, official. Lawyers here. In another world, in another life, that might have been routine. But Persico already knew this wasn't a normal visit. Something had shifted in the air the past few weeks. Whispers on the prison yard. Guards speaking in clipped sentences when they thought no one was listening. Men in suits, not uniforms, walking the corridors with folders under their arms. Something was coming. What awaited him in the visiting room was the first ripple of what would soon become a tidal wave. His attorney leaned in, voice low, urgency etched into every word. The Justice Department had moved. Not on one family, not on one boss, but on all of them. It was called the Commission Case. For decades, the 5 families of New York had met through the Mafia Commission, an invisible boardroom where the city's underworld carved up territories, settled disputes, and voted on matters of life and death. Law enforcement had always suspected it existed, but proving it had been like chasing smoke. Now, federal prosecutors were ready to light the match. The indictments were massive. They accused the commission's ruling bosses, from the Gambinos, the Lucchese's, the Genovese, the Bananos, and the Colombos, of running a nationwide criminal enterprise under the racketeering laws. And Persico, despite already serving time, was listed as the official boss of the Colombo family. His name was right there alongside giants like Anthony, Fat Tony, Salerno, and Paul Castellano. For the FBI, this was the crown jewel. Years of wiretaps, informants, and surveillance had been building toward this moment. For Persico, it was an existential threat. If the government won, this wouldn't just mean a few years behind bars. It would mean decades, possibly the rest of his life, in a federal cell. But before they could put him on trial, they had to bring him to court. And Carmine Persico wasn't about to make that easy. In the summer of 1984, Persico made his move. Using his lawyers, loyal captains, and a network of safe houses, he slipped out of the prison system and into the wind. To the FBI, it was a stunning embarrassment. One of the most powerful mob bosses in America had simply vanished. Overnight, Persico became more than just a defendant. He became a fugitive. The Bureau added him to its 10 most wanted list, plastering his face on posters in post offices and police stations across the country. His mugshot was suddenly sharing space with armed robbers, serial killers, and terrorists. The media loved it. The snake on the run, they called him, the mob boss who could vanish in a city of millions. Life on the run was a different kind of war. Persico couldn't walk into his usual restaurants. He couldn't visit family openly. Every phone call had to be carefully routed, every meeting layered in misdirection. He moved through safe apartments, sometimes staying only a night before slipping out before dawn. His captains acted as couriers, carrying his orders from borough to borough. Even on the run, he insisted on keeping control. The Colombos would not see him as weak. The FBI chased him hard. Tips came in from all directions. A sighting in Florida, a whisper from an informant in Queens, a neighbor in New Jersey convinced the quiet man in the apartment upstairs looked familiar. Surveillance teams staked out the homes of associates, parked outside suspected stash houses, and followed faint trails that often led to dead ends. But Persico wasn't just hiding. He was maneuvering. He still had a trial to fight, and even in absentia, he wanted to be ready. From safe houses, he worked with his lawyers, reviewing transcripts, suggesting strategies, keeping one foot in the courtroom even as he evaded the marshals outside it. Every fugitive knows the game eventually turns. You can't run forever, not with the weight of the federal government pressing down. In early 1985, Persico's luck began to thin. The FBI got word of a trusted associate willing to talk, a man who knew one of the safe addresses. Agents moved quietly, surrounding the location, waiting for confirmation that their target was inside. It happened fast. No warning, no chase through alleys, no Hollywood shootout. Just a knock at the door in the gray hours of morning, and a half-dozen agents pouring into the room. Persico, calm as ever, raised his hands. If he was rattled, he didn't show it. The snake had been cornered before, and each time, he had found a way to twist out. In the Bureau's official photographs from that day, Persico's expression is almost unreadable. Not fear, not resignation, something cooler. As if he were already thinking 3 moves ahead, already calculating how to fight the case, how to keep his grip on the Colombos even as the trial loomed. The ride back into custody was quiet, the city passing by in a blur through the backseat window. Outside, people were heading to work, kids were running to school, and no one knew that one of the most powerful crime bosses in America was in the car next to them, shackled but still dangerous. For the FBI, his capture was a victory, but the real prize would be a conviction. For Persico, this was just another round in a fight he'd been waging his entire life. A battle not just for freedom, but for control. And as the courthouse doors closed behind him once more, the commission case shifted into high gear. A case that would shake the Mafia to its foundations and test whether even the snake could survive when the cage was built this tight. The courtroom was silent, but it wasn't the usual silence of legal formality. This was the silence that comes when an entire room realizes it's about to see something it has never seen before and might never see again. The defendant, Carmine, the snake, Persico, boss of the Colombo crime family, walked past the rows of lawyers and sat down at the defense table. But there was no attorney beside him, no team of high-priced mob lawyers shielding him from the storm. He was representing himself, a decision that baffled prosecutors, fascinated reporters, and worried even some of his own men. The year was 1986, and the Mafia Commission trial had already been called the trial of the century. Federal prosecutors had brought RICO charges, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, against the entire leadership of New York's 5 families. It was a legal sledgehammer designed to treat the Mafia like a single criminal corporation, and Persico's name was etched into the indictment as the boss of the Colombos. In theory, defending yourself in a trial like this was madness. RICO cases were labyrinths of wiretaps, surveillance, cooperating witnesses, and decades of alleged crimes. Most defendants wanted a wall of legal professionals to block the blows. Persico wanted the opposite. He wanted to stand in the middle of the fight, barehanded, and take the punches himself. Why? That was the question whispered in the gallery. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was distrust of lawyers who might sell him out. Maybe, and this was the theory that unsettled the prosecution most, he believed he was simply smarter than them. From the first day, he turned the courtroom into his stage. When prosecutors laid out their version of the commission as an underworld board of directors, Persico leaned forward, asking sharp, precise questions that cut at the credibility of their witnesses. When they played wiretaps, he parsed the language, pointing out alternative meanings, arguing that our friend didn't necessarily mean our associate in crime. His voice was calm, never raised, his tone almost teacher-like, as if he were correcting a student's mistaken answer. But Persico wasn't just cross-examining witnesses. He was performing for 2 audiences, the jury and the underworld still watching from the shadows. Every moment he showed command of the room was a signal to his men that the snake was still dangerous, still in control. The prosecutors, led by the relentless Rudolph Giuliani, pushed back hard. They painted Persico not as an innocent man wrongly accused, but as the spider at the center of a web of extortion, murder, and corruption stretching back decades. They rolled out charts of the 5 families, brought in law enforcement agents to explain the structure, and let informants describe the rituals, the codes, the consequences of betrayal. Persico countered with precision, but the weight of evidence was crushing. Wiretaps caught him speaking in the coded shorthand of mob business. Surveillance showed him meeting with captains from other families. And the informants, men who had once sworn loyalty to him, told the jury in careful, chilling detail how orders were given and how bodies disappeared. The commission trial ended in late 1986. The jury found Persico guilty on multiple counts, including racketeering and conspiracy to commit murder. The judge sentenced him to 100 years in prison. For most men, that would have been the end, the final chapter. But for Carmine Persico, it was only the first verdict. Because while the commission trial was wrapping up, another storm was gathering. This time, the target wasn't the Mafia as a whole. It was the Colombo family itself. The Colombo RICO trial in Brooklyn would put Persico at the center again. This time charged with running his own crew like a criminal empire, ordering hits, and running rackets that touched every corner of the borough. And once again, Persico chose to represent himself. It was a move that infuriated the judge. Federal court is not a place for grandstanding, and every self-represented defendant slows the process to a crawl. But Persico had studied the law like a man studying an enemy's playbook. From his prison cell, he had pored over legal texts, dissected transcripts, and learned procedural rules. When the Colombo trial opened in 1987, Persico walked into the courtroom wearing a well-tailored suit and the faintest hint of a smile. If he felt the weight of the previous sentence pressing down, he didn't show it. Instead, he attacked the prosecution's witnesses with the same precision as before, questioning timelines, poking holes in memory, asking about motives. One former associate claimed Persico had ordered a murder over a botched loan sharking payment. Persico asked the man to describe the meeting where the order was supposedly given. Then, calmly, he produced prison records showing he had been in custody that day. The witness stumbled, prosecutors scrambled, and for a moment, the jury's attention shifted. But one moment was not enough. The government had too much: taped conversations, paper trails, and witnesses who had already survived cross-examination in other mob trials. The defense Persico mounted was clever, but the facts were relentless. When the verdict came, it was devastating. Guilty. Again. This time, the sentence was 39 years, to run consecutive to the 100 from the commission trial. The math was brutal. Carmine Persico, then in his 50s, had just been handed a total of 139 years in federal prison. A death sentence in all but name. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps afterward, shouting questions as Persico was led away in shackles. He said nothing, only glancing toward the cameras with a look that was impossible to read, part defiance, part calculation, as if he were already considering his next move even as the cell door closed in his mind. Inside the Bureau of Prisons, word spread fast. The snake was coming back, and this time, he wasn't leaving. Guards and inmates alike understood what that meant. A man who had managed to run one of New York's most dangerous crime families from behind bars was about to serve the rest of his life in one. But if anyone expected Persico to fade, they were mistaken. Even with 139 years ahead of him, he would continue to pull strings, settle scores, and influence the streets of Brooklyn. Proof that for some men, prison walls aren't the end of power, just the boundaries of a new empire. And as the gates closed behind him, the question wasn't whether Carmine Persico could survive life in prison. The real question was how many lives outside those walls would still be shaped by the decisions he made inside. The air inside Marion Penitentiary was heavy with the smell of metal and disinfectant, the unmistakable scent of a place designed to erase a man's identity. But for Carmine Persico, those steel bars and cinder block walls were not the end of his reign. They were simply the new walls of his office. Most men in his position would have vanished. A life sentence, 139 years, had a way of draining ambition. But Persico was not most men. Even in shackles, he was still the official boss of the Colombo family. And in the Mafia, the title of boss wasn't just ceremonial. It was currency. It was power. It was the throne. Running a crime family from a federal prison was like conducting an orchestra while underwater. Every command slowed, distorted, and filtered through dangerous intermediaries. But Persico had always been patient, and patience was a weapon. He didn't need to bark orders. He could plant an idea like a seed and let it grow in the mind of a loyal captain until it became action. His methods were careful. The prison mail system was a minefield, monitored for coded language. So Persico's letters read like harmless personal notes, mentions of old friends, favors, or keeping the garden tended. To law enforcement, it sounded like nothing. To his men on the street, It was a blueprint. Face-to-face meetings were even more delicate. Visits from family members became the lifeline of his empire. A nephew, a cousin, or an old neighborhood friend would sit across the table in the visitor's room, smiling for the guards, while the conversation beneath the smile was anything but casual. Names were never spoken. Decisions were hinted at, never spelled out. But everyone understood. The Colombos were no strangers to instability. They had endured 2 internal wars and the near assassination of their own boss. The 1980s had left the family scarred, with factions ready to splinter if the center of power wavered. Persico's greatest trick in those years wasn't in expanding his territory. It was in holding the family together, making sure no one dared think the boss was gone. His captains, men like Andrew, Andy Mush, Russo, and other longtime loyalists, acted as his voice on the street. They collected tribute, settled disputes, and kept the family's rackets running. Loan sharking, extortion, gambling, and the occasional contract killing. They knew Persico's style. No flash, no unnecessary bloodshed, but an iron grip on respect and loyalty. The FBI, of course, knew what was happening. They called it leadership by proxy, and they hated it. Wiretaps from New York picked up street captains referring to the old man and the guy in the can when discussing big decisions. But building a case was difficult. Persico was too careful, too smart. He'd been in the game for decades, and he understood that direct orders left trails. Suggestions, however, vanished like smoke. In the underworld, Persico's ability to rule from prison only added to his legend. Other bosses had tried and failed, their empires crumbling as lieutenants seized power for themselves. But the snake's words still carried weight in Brooklyn, even from 1,000 miles away in a maximum security cell. It was the kind of control you couldn't buy. It came from decades of surviving betrayals, wars, and federal prosecutions without ever losing his seat at the table. The guards at Marion didn't miss it, either. They saw the way inmates deferred to him, how even the toughest men in the yard gave him space. In a place built to strip away identity, Persico still walked with the quiet authority of a man who had something the others didn't, an empire beyond the walls. But power, even in prison, came with danger. The Colombos were restless, and younger soldiers with ambition didn't always like taking orders from a man they couldn't see. Rival factions began to whisper, suggesting the family needed a boss who could be on the street, not trapped in a cell. Persico handled these challenges the way he always had, by outmaneuvering them. A promotion here, a quiet threat there. Sometimes, all it took was reminding a would-be usurper of what happened to the last man who crossed him. By the late 1980s, the other 5 families had accepted the reality. Carmine Persico was still the boss, and anyone doing business with the Colombos was ultimately doing business with him. Even the Gambinos and Genovese, families known for exploiting weakness, treaded carefully. They'd seen Persico endure more than most, and still keep his grip. The government, frustrated, doubled down. They monitored his visitors, intercepted his letters, even planted informants near him in prison. But Persico had grown up in a world where every conversation might have an extra set of ears. He played the long game, never revealing more than necessary, never trusting anyone completely. For Persico, prison wasn't just confinement. It was camouflage. The FBI might have thought they'd neutralized him, but in his mind, being locked away gave him a certain advantage. He could let the heat cool on the street, keep his enemies guessing, and still direct the flow of money and influence like a chess player moving pieces from behind a curtain. Yet there were moments, brief, private moments, when the weight of it all pressed in. Alone in his cell at night, the noise of the prison fading to a low hum, Persico would think of the streets he hadn't walked in years. The sounds of Brooklyn in summer, the smell of fresh bread from the corner bakery, the faces of old friends, some long gone. Regret wasn't something he admitted easily, but it was there, just beneath the surface. Still, those moments never lasted long. Carmine Persico wasn't built to dwell on the past. Every day in prison was another day to prove he could outlast anyone, prosecutors, rivals, even time itself. He had turned his cell into an office, the guards into reluctant witnesses, and the federal government into an unwilling audience for his defiance. In the end, the man known as the Snake had found a way to keep striking, even from inside the cage. His reign might have been harder to see, his voice harder to hear, but it was there, woven into the decisions made in smoky back rooms, whispered in coded phone calls, passed along in a nod or a handshake in the streets of New York. And as the years went on, one truth became clear to everyone watching. The bars might have held Carmine Persico's body, but they had never touched his crown. Somewhere beyond the prison walls, the next war for control of the Colombo family was already stirring, and the Snake, chained but not broken, was still coiled and waiting to strike. It began with a name passed quietly across a prison visiting room table, Victor Orena. To most people, it was just another name from Brooklyn. But to the Colombo family, it was the name of a man who would be handed the keys to a kingdom that wasn't his. Carmine Persico was still the official boss, even if the walls of Marion Penitentiary kept him from the streets. But the mob was not a patient organism. It needed a heartbeat, someone in the open air to keep the blood flowing, collecting tribute, mediating disputes, keeping soldiers fed and enemies in check. In the Mafia, if you left a vacuum, someone else would fill it. Persico knew this better than anyone. So, he didn't leave a vacuum. He filled it with men he thought he could control. The first choice was calculated. Orena was a Brooklyn-born capo, quiet in public but relentless in business. He'd made his money the old-fashioned way, gambling, loans, a little hijacking when the score was worth it. He was no street cowboy, no hothead looking to grab headlines. Persico saw in him a placeholder, someone who could steer the ship without thinking he owned it. From his prison cell, Persico gave the word. Orena would be the acting boss. The appointment moved through the family like a ripple in dark water, unspoken yet understood. Captains took note. Soldiers adjusted their loyalties accordingly. And the FBI, they noticed too. Orena stepped into the role with a kind of cautious confidence. He knew the job came with invisible strings, each one leading back to a man in a cage hundreds of miles away. Every major decision had to flow through a chain of whispers, a cousin visiting prison, a phone call disguised as small talk, a letter with lines that meant something only to the initiated. But power, even borrowed power, changes a man. On the street, Orena was treated like a king. Tributes flowed to him. He settled disputes with a nod or a single word. His presence in social clubs brought silence, then deference. The respect that once belonged only to Persico now brushed against Orena's shoulders. And respect in the mob was more addictive than money. It was the kind of thing that made a man start to wonder if maybe he didn't need the guy in prison after all. Persico had seen it before. Acting bosses who forgot they acting part of the title didn't last long. That's why Orena's every move was quietly monitored by Persico loyalists. Men like Andrew Andy Mush Russo and others who had stood with the Snake through wars and indictments made sure the message was clear. Carmine Persico was still the boss, no matter who was holding the chair. The FBI tried to read the temperature of the Colombo family during these years. To them, Orena was an opportunity, a man in the open who might be pressured, flipped, or baited into a mistake. They put him under surveillance, tapped phones, sent informants sniffing around. But Orena was cautious, almost to a fault. He knew what they were looking for, and he wasn't going to hand it to them. Still, prison walls couldn't block ambition forever. As months turned into years, Orena began to see himself not as a caretaker, but as a rightful leader. He was building relationships with other families, making moves that didn't always run through Persico first. It was subtle, a meeting not mentioned, a decision made without waiting for the green light. But subtle shifts in the Mafia could lead to seismic consequences. Persico, even behind bars, could feel the change. The flow of information was slower, less precise. Whispers reached him of Orena making his own calls, pushing deals that seemed designed to build his own network of loyalty rather than maintain the family's unity. The old boss's instinct, the one that had kept him alive through decades of mob politics, told him trouble was coming. By the late 1980s, Orena wasn't the only acting boss Persico would rely on. When the heat got too strong, or when prison politics made communication harder, Persico rotated men through the role. Some were fiercely loyal placeholders, content to follow the script. Others saw the job as a stepping stone to something more permanent. Every appointment was a gamble. A loyal man could turn, and an ambitious man could overplay his hand. But for Persico, the alternative was worse. Leaving the chair empty and letting the streets decide who filled it. The arrangement was a balancing act. Persico had to project strength without appearing unreachable. He had to keep his acting bosses feeling important enough to follow orders, but never so important that they forgot who had put them there. On the street, the Colombo family looked stable enough. The rackets were running, the books were balanced, and the other families weren't testing the waters too much. But beneath the surface, fault lines were forming. Every decision Persico made from prison had to be filtered through layers of trust and ambition, and every man who sat in the acting boss's chair carried the risk of turning the family's fragile peace into open war. The truth was, Carmine Persico had built an empire strong enough to survive his absence, but not without cracks. And in the Mafia, cracks always meant someone was ready to pry them open. The FBI couldn't see the full picture, but they could sense the tension. Agents described the Colombos as a family waiting for something to happen, a chessboard where too many pieces were eyeing the king's position. Persico himself played it like a long con. He didn't react to every small sign of disloyalty. He let things play out, watching how his acting bosses handled temptation, pressure, and the lure of permanent power. Some passed the test and stepped down when told. Others, well, history would show what happened to the ones who didn't. And then came the moment that would tip the balance. Arena's ambition was no longer a whisper, it was a drumbeat. Persico could hear it even from his cell. The careful alliance between boss and acting boss was fraying, and the men loyal to each side were starting to choose corners. The old guard knew what was coming. The streets could smell it. And the FBI, they started sharpening their knives. In the world Carmine Persico had ruled for decades, this kind of tension didn't fade. It only built until someone made the first move. And when that happened, the Colombo family would be pulled into one of the bloodiest chapters in its history. From his prison cell, the snake was watching, waiting, and deciding who would strike first. The first shot rang out on a warm night in Brooklyn, and in that single instant, decades of simmering loyalty and quiet resentment exploded into open war. The victim was no outsider, no enemy from another family. He was one of their own. That was the rule-breaking signal. The Third Colombo War had begun. It was not like the flashy gangland wars Hollywood liked to imagine. There were no Tommy gun massacres in the middle of Times Square. This was quieter, colder, and far more personal. The targets were men who had once toasted each other at weddings, stood as godfathers to each other's children. And now, each man carried the knowledge that any familiar face could be the one to pull the trigger. At the center of it all were two men, one behind prison walls, the other walking free. Carmine Persico, the snake, was still the official boss, still giving orders from his cell. Victor Arena, the acting boss, had grown tired of the acting part. He saw himself as the rightful ruler now, and more than a few captains agreed. The split was not over honor, or money, or even ideology. It was over power, pure and simple. To the FBI, it was a gift, a self-inflicted wound in one of New York's 5 families. But to the men in the Colombo family, it was survival. Every day was a choice. Stay loyal to Persico and risk Arena's wrath, or align with Arena and pray Persico's people didn't get to you first. The early months were tense, but calculated. Both sides tested each other with small moves. A threatening phone call, a shadow in the corner booth of a diner, a warning shot into the windshield of a parked car. But the line could only hold for so long. The first Real hit came in the summer of 1991. It wasn't just an attack. It was a statement. After that, the streets turned into a hunting ground. Brooklyn became a patchwork of invisible borders. There were certain social clubs you didn't walk past, certain neighborhoods where your car shouldn't be parked. Men began driving different routes home, avoiding routines. Those who ignored the rules ended up in the back pages of the daily news. Grainy crime scene photos of bodies slumped over steering wheels, blood pooling on cracked pavement. Persico loyalists struck back hard. They weren't just defending territory, they were defending the boss's reputation. To lose to Arena would mean Carmine Persico's legacy, built over decades of calculated power plays, would be erased while he was still breathing. In the world of the Mafia, that was worse than death. One by one, names fell from the family's roster. Gunfire in parking lots. Drive-by shootings in broad daylight. A man lured to a peace meeting, only to be cut down before he could sit at the table. No one was safe, not even the old-timers who had kept their heads down for years. The war didn't care about history. For the city, it was like watching shadows fighting in the dark. The average New Yorker might hear about a body on the news, but they didn't know that each murder shifted the balance of the family. The press called it a mob civil war, but inside the Colombo family, the men called it by its true name, a purge. Detectives from the NYPD's organized crime unit worked double shifts, charting the growing list of dead and wounded. They built diagrams showing who was aligned with whom, but those lines kept changing. One day a man was an Arena supporter. The next day, his crew was leaning back toward Persico. Fear was a currency, and both sides spent it freely. Even prison couldn't shield Persico from the violence. News reached him through visits and coded letters, and each new killing was both a warning and a challenge. His power depended on proving that he could still control the streets from behind bars. If he lost the war, he would become just another forgotten name in mob history, a boss in name only. On the outside, Arena moved like a man who believed he had already won. He wore the mantle of leadership in public, attending weddings, collecting tributes, making decisions without running them past the cell in Marion Penitentiary. But that confidence also made him a bigger target. Persico's loyalists began planning not just to chip away at his crew, but to cut the head off entirely. The war reached its ugliest point in 1992. The streets ran with vendettas. Gunmen didn't always hit their marks, and when they missed, innocent people paid the price. A stray bullet took the life of a bystander in one hit gone wrong, and public outrage pushed the FBI to make the Colombo war a top priority. Suddenly, there were federal wiretaps everywhere, undercover agents sniffing around, and grand juries waiting to pounce. Still, the shootings didn't stop. If anything, they got bolder. In one infamous hit, gunmen opened fire on a car in broad daylight in a busy Brooklyn neighborhood. The driver died instantly, his passenger barely surviving. Witnesses described the shooters as calm, methodical, men who had done this before and would do it again. The fear wasn't just on the streets. Inside both factions, paranoia ruled. Men refused to sit with their backs to the door. Meetings were held in motion, literally walking and talking on crowded streets to avoid bugs. Every phone call was clipped, every message vague. And still, the bodies kept dropping. For Persico, the stakes were personal. This wasn't just about maintaining his title. It was about reminding the Mafia world that he was still the snake, dangerous, calculating, and impossible to corner. For Arena, it was about survival. Once a man challenged the throne in the Mafia, there was no going back. Either you won, or you died. By late 1993, the war had left more than a dozen men dead, with dozens more wounded or vanished. The bloodshed had weakened the Colombo family to the point where other families began circling, ready to claim territory or absorb rackets. That was the unspoken danger of mob civil wars. While you were killing each other, someone else was getting rich off your business. The end didn't come from a handshake or a peace deal. It came from law enforcement's relentless pressure. The FBI and NYPD began scooping up soldiers, captains, and associates from both sides. Wiretap evidence and turncoat testimonies poured in. Arrests didn't just take men off the street. They broke the chain of communication, made it harder to coordinate attacks, and drained the family's resources. Victor Arena himself would eventually be arrested, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison, his bid for permanent leadership crushed under the same system that had been trying to nail Persico for years. For Persico, it was a twisted victory. The rival who had challenged him was neutralized, but the cost had been staggering. The Colombo family was no longer the tight, feared organization it had been. It was a wounded animal, and in the Mafia, wounded animals don't last long. Still, Behind bars, Persico allowed himself the smallest satisfaction. He had outlasted Arena. The snake's grip, however bloodied, was still there. But the war had changed everything. Trust was gone. The next generation of Colombo soldiers would come up in a world where loyalty was just a word, and leadership meant surviving the next betrayal. And somewhere in the quiet of his prison cell, Carmine Persico had to know there would be no fourth Colombo war. Because the next time, there might not be enough of the family left to fight one. The blood had dried on the Brooklyn streets. The shooters had gone to prison. But the scars, those were never going away. And for the snake, there was still one more challenge ahead. Not from the streets, but from the relentless weight of time itself. The war was over, but the Colombo family was a ruin. The streets were quieter now, but not in a way that brought peace. It was the kind of quiet you hear in a burned-out building, hollow, fragile, and smelling faintly of smoke. Men who had once strutted through Brooklyn with easy confidence now kept their heads down. Crews were smaller. Rackets had been stolen or abandoned. The air was thick with the sense that the family could crumble entirely if the wrong move was made. From his prison cell, Carmine Persico knew exactly what had to happen. The Colombo name had to be put back together, piece by piece, like a broken vase carefully glued in the shadows. There could be no public displays, no bold claims to power. This rebuild had to be quiet, patient, and, above all, loyal. Persico had learned a hard truth in the war. Loyalty was worth more than muscle. A man with a gun could protect you for a day, but a man who believed in you would protect you for a lifetime. And so, when it came time to appoint a leader to run the streets, he didn't look for the loudest or the most feared. He looked for someone who could be trusted to carry his voice beyond prison walls. That man was Andrew Russo. Russo wasn't some flashy gangster craving headlines. He was a steady hand, a man who could move money, settle disputes, and, most importantly, keep the family from tearing itself apart again. To the outside world, he might have looked like a placeholder, a man keeping the boss's chair warm. But inside the Colombo family, everyone understood Russo was Persico's man. Every decision he made, every order he gave, carried the weight of the snake's authority. But rebuilding was more than naming an acting boss. The family had been left with holes in its structure. Captains dead or in prison, crews scattered, alliances frayed. Persico oversaw the restructuring like a general redrawing a battlefield map. Crews were consolidated. New captains were elevated from the ranks, not because they were the most dangerous, but because they could be controlled. The Colombos had to move carefully now. The FBI was watching for any sign of resurgence, eager to crush it before it could take root. The war had given law enforcement something they could never buy: endless informants. Men on both sides of the faction fight had flipped to save themselves. It meant Persico's orders had to travel in whispers, through layers of trusted messengers, each one sworn to silence. Russo played the role well. He kept the family's operations alive without drawing unnecessary attention. Gambling dens reopened quietly. Loan sharking rackets started flowing again. A few construction contracts, always a Colombo specialty, were pulled back under their control. It was not the empire of old, but it was enough to keep the lights on and the crews fed. Still, Persico knew this arrangement could not last forever. Russo was loyal, but he was not family, not by blood. And for Carmine Persico, blood had always been the ultimate insurance policy. If you wanted to guarantee your influence for decades, you put your own kin in the chair. That opportunity came when his son, Alphonse "Ali Boy" Persico, came of age in the life. Ali Boy was not just a name. He was an extension of the snake's will. Raised around the whispers of power and the iron rules of Cosa Nostra, he understood that being boss was not about being the toughest man in the room. It was about being the most untouchable. When Persico appointed his son as acting boss, it sent a message louder than any press release. The Colombo family was no longer in caretaker mode. This was a dynasty. The war might have cost them blood and money, but it had not broken the Persico grip on power. In fact, it had made that grip even more determined. Alphonse brought his own style to the role. Where Russo had been cautious, Ali Boy was sharper-edged, more willing to push boundaries. He reasserted control over lost rackets, made moves to expand into new territory, and reminded anyone watching that the Colombo name still carried weight. But even as he built, the walls were closing in. The FBI had not forgotten. If anything, they were waiting for this moment, the sign that the family was rising again. Undercover agents lingered in the same bars as Colombo associates. Wiretaps hummed on payphones. Surveillance vans parked on street corners like silent predators. Every new move the Colombos made risked drawing the wrong kind of attention. From prison, Persico walked a tightrope. Too much aggression, and the FBI would smash the family again. Too little, and rivals would see weakness. The solution was to build in layers, legitimate fronts on the outside, criminal profit underneath. A trucking company here, a construction union there. The family was weaving itself back into the fabric of New York, one quiet stitch at a time. But there were still dangers inside the walls. Not every soldier was happy to see the Persico bloodline holding onto the top spot. Some saw Ali Boy as too young, too inexperienced, living off his father's reputation. Others remembered the bloodshed of the war and wondered if it was worth staying loyal to a family that had already bled itself nearly dry. Persico countered those doubts the way only he could, by reminding people of the consequences. Messages were sent, not always with words. A stubborn captain suddenly lost a key source of income. A suspected trader's car was found torched. In the Mafia, control is as much about what people fear will happen as what actually does. By the mid-90s, the Colombos were standing again. Not tall, not unshakable, but standing. The war had faded into memory, though the scars were everywhere. In the empty chairs at old hangouts, in the silences during toasts, in the wary looks exchanged between men who had once fought on opposite sides. Persico's plan had worked, at least for the moment. Russo had stabilized the family when it needed steady hands. Ali Boy had injected new energy, re-establishing the Persico dynasty. The FBI had not yet managed to break the chain of command, and the other families knew the Colombos were not going away. But rebuilding a Mafia family is like stacking cards in a windstorm. One wrong move, one betrayal, and the whole thing comes crashing down. Persico had been in the life long enough to know that the real danger often comes not in the heat of war, but in the false comfort of peace. And as he sat in his prison cell, surrounded by concrete and steel, the snake understood something chilling. Peace in the Mafia is never permanent. It is only the pause before the next move. Somewhere out there, in a back room or a corner booth, someone was already planning for that moment. And when it came, Persico knew the family would either rise higher than before or be wiped from the streets of New York for good. The morning air in Brooklyn was heavy with the kind of damp chill that clings to the skin, seeping into the bones. May 15, 1999, a date that would burn itself into the history of the Colombo crime family. William "Wild Bill" Cudalo, the family's underboss, left his house that day with the confidence of a man who thought he was untouchable. He told his wife he had a meeting. He didn't say with who. In this life, you didn't ask too many questions. Cudalo had been through wars, literal ones in the Mafia sense. He had fought on the arena side during the bloody Colombo Civil War in the early 90s, when Persico loyalists and arena supporters turned the streets into open battlefields. Back then, Wild Bill had been a man you didn't cross. He had charisma, muscle, and the kind of street charm that could make allies out of rivals. But the thing about the Mafia is, wars end, grudges don't. From his prison cell, Carmine Persico had rebuilt the family in his image. The Persico faction held the crown. Cudalo, despite his arena allegiance in the past, had been brought back into the fold, given the prestigious role of underboss. On paper, it was a reconciliation. In reality, it was a leash. That Friday morning, Cudalo climbed into his Lincoln Town car. His driver steered through Brooklyn streets toward the Bay Ridge neighborhood. Cudalo's destination was a union hall, the headquarters for the family's labor rackets. Meetings like this were routine, the lifeblood of organized crime. But in the Mafia, routine is where death hides. Some say he had been summoned to a sit-down with Alphonse, Ali Boy Persico, Carmine's son and acting boss at the time. Others believe the meeting was just a pretext. What's certain is this. After that morning, no one saw William Cudalo alive again. For days, the streets buzzed with whispers. In the underworld, disappearances speak louder than gunfire. There was no body, no public hit, no messy drive-by. This was the kind of work done by professionals who knew how to erase a man from the earth without leaving a trace. Cudalo's crew was stunned. Some waited for a ransom call that never came. Others, veterans of Mafia politics, understood instantly. This was a message. A quiet, brutal reminder of where power truly rested. You didn't challenge the Persico regime, not openly, not privately, not ever. Law enforcement took notice immediately. The FBI had been tracking Cudalo for years. To them, his disappearance had all the hallmarks of a classic mafia going to the mattresses move, a removal of a threat before he could become a problem. Agents began knocking on doors, hauling in low-level associates, leaning on anyone who might talk. But fear, in Cosa Nostra, is a stronger lock than any prison cell. Inside the Colombo family, the shift was immediate. Cudalo's position as underboss was quietly filled, his rackets absorbed by men the Persicos could trust. There was no ceremony, no announcement, just a silent reshuffling of power, like pieces on a chessboard. The only thing missing was the body. For years, the absence of that body was both a shield and a weapon. Without a corpse, prosecutors had no murder case. On the streets, the mystery kept men on edge. Was Cudalo buried in some unmarked grave? Was he at the bottom of the ocean? Or had the Persicos found some new, unthinkable way to dispose of him entirely? The truth, when it finally emerged, was as old school as it was chilling. In 2008, nearly a decade after his disappearance, investigators found what they had been looking for: skeletal remains buried in an industrial lot in Farmingdale, Long Island. Dental records confirmed it was Wild Bill. The underboss who had vanished in broad daylight had been dumped in a shallow grave like yesterday's trash. The details of that day's events came into sharper focus during trials. Cudalo had arrived at the meeting expecting business. Instead, he had been met by trusted Colombo figures, men he thought were friends. Somewhere in that union hall, or nearby, the conversation turned. Words were exchanged, the kind you can't take back. A gun came out. In the Mafia, death rarely comes as a surprise. It comes as a betrayal. His body was transported quietly, wrapped, and buried without ceremony. His personal effects were disposed of, his presence wiped clean. By the time the sun set that evening, William Cudalo no longer existed, except as a warning. Why him? The answer, like most Mafia murders, was layered. Cudalo had power. He had charisma. He had a loyal crew that could rival the Persico loyalists in size and influence. Even if he wasn't openly challenging Alley Boy, his very presence was a threat, a reminder that the old Arena faction still had teeth. And for Carmine Persico, ruling from a cell, threats were unacceptable. The message rippled through the underworld. If the Persicos could erase the underboss, a man with decades in the life, with deep connections and a fearsome reputation, then no one was untouchable. This was a statement killing, the kind that changes behavior without a single word spoken. But the murder had consequences. Law enforcement, already circling the Colombo family, now had a high-profile disappearance to exploit. Informants began to surface, their loyalty bought by the FBI's promises or by their own fear of ending up like Cudalo. The Persicos had removed a threat, but they had also drawn the kind of heat that never goes away. The Cudalo killing became a central piece of federal cases in the years to come. Witnesses testified about meetings, about whispers of orders handed down from prison cells. Prosecutors painted a picture of Carmine Persico and his son as a father-son dictatorship, eliminating anyone who might destabilize their reign. For the family, the damage was twofold. On the street, there was less trust than ever. In the courtroom, there was more evidence than they could afford. Men who had once sworn blood oaths were taking the stand, pointing fingers, trading honor for leniency. The years after the discovery of Cudalo's remains were marked by trials, convictions, and long sentences. For the Persicos, the killing had served its immediate purpose. the removal of a rival, but it had also accelerated the erosion of the family's strength. Still, inside the Colombo world, there was no regret. In their logic, the decision had been necessary. A snake, after all, doesn't survive by letting predators roam free in its territory. Carmine Persico had spent his life outmaneuvering enemies, both on the streets and in prison. To him, the Cudalo murder was just another calculated move in a lifetime of them. But for those who knew Wild Bill, friends, family, and even rivals, the memory of his last day never faded. One moment, he was climbing into his car, headed for a meeting he thought was routine. The next, he was gone, swallowed by the very life he had helped shape. And in the cold arithmetic of the Mafia, that was the real lesson. You could be feared. You could be respected. You could even be loved. But in the end, you were only as safe as the trust of the men standing next to you. And trust, in this life, can vanish faster than the echo of a gunshot in an empty room. Even now, decades later, the name William Cudalo carries a weight in the old neighborhoods. Not just because of the man he was, but because of what his death symbolized, that in the Colombo family, even the highest rank could be a death sentence if you stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. And somewhere, in that invisible space between loyalty and survival, the seeds of the family's next crisis were already beginning to grow. It began with the clang of a courtroom door, a sound that seemed to echo far beyond the federal building in Brooklyn. February of 2009, the day the gavel came down on Alphonse "Alley Boy" Persico, the son of Carmine the Snake Persico, the heir apparent, the man groomed to keep the Colombo family's name alive in the streets of New York. He stood at the defense table in a crisp suit, shoulders squared, jaw set. But the eyes gave him away. There was no defiance there, no smugness, just a simmering recognition, the understanding that the government had closed its jaws around him, and there was no slipping free this time. The charge, ordering the murder of underboss William "Wild Bill" Cudalo, a killing that had happened 10 years earlier, buried in whispers and shadows, until the skeleton in a Long Island lot brought it roaring back to life. For prosecutors, the trial was a gift wrapped in concrete and bone. They laid it out for the jury like a grim movie reel, the long-standing tensions inside the Colombo family, the rivalry that had never truly healed after the Third Colombo War, the calculated decision to lure Cudalo to his death in May of 1999. They painted Alley Boy as more than just his father's son. They called him the architect of a betrayal that cemented the Persico stranglehold over the family. Inside the gallery, the atmosphere was taut. Colombo loyalists kept their faces neutral, their eyes forward. But there was an unspoken weight in the air, the knowledge that if Alley Boy went down, the Persico dynasty would take a blow unlike anything it had suffered before. The snake had survived decades in prison and still managed to run his empire. But his son was different. Alley Boy had been the bridge to the street, the man who could move in both worlds. The prison corridors where Carmine ruled like a phantom king, and the Brooklyn streets where envelopes changed hands in diners and backrooms. The testimony cut deep. Former associates turned government witnesses described hushed meetings, coded phone calls, and the unmistakable command that Cudalo be taken care of. The language was classic mob understatement, a few casual words that meant a man would be erased from the earth. One witness, a Colombo soldier who decided the witness stand was better than a coffin, described how Alley Boy smiled when he heard the job was done. He said it was for the good of the family, the witness told the jury. In the mob, those words were a shield and a death sentence. But the defense fought back hard. Alley Boy's attorneys called the witnesses liars, rats trading testimony for leniency. They pointed out the lack of direct physical evidence tying him to the crime. They reminded the jury that the Mafia's own code bred false stories as easily as it did bullets. But in the end, it wasn't enough. The verdict came swift and brutal, guilty on racketeering charges, including the murder of William Cudalo. When the foreman read the word guilty, Alley Boy didn't flinch. He just sat back, staring straight ahead, as if the walls themselves had finally closed in. Later, the judge handed down the sentence: life in prison. No parole, no deals, The heir to the Colombo throne was now just another inmate with a number stitched to his shirt. The news rippled through the underworld like a shockwave. In the coffee shops and clubs where old-timers still gathered, the whispers were tinged with disbelief. The Persicos had been untouchable for so long that the idea of the next generation rotting in a federal cell felt unnatural. Some saw it as the end of an era. Others saw it as an opening. On the street, the Colombo family structure began to tremble. Without Alley Boy, the line of communication from Carmine's prison cell to the crews in Brooklyn was fractured. Messages still moved, through attorneys, through visiting rooms, through men who knew how to talk without moving their lips. But the immediacy was gone. Decisions that once took hours now took days. Days turned into weeks. In the Mafia, that kind of lag can be fatal. And it wasn't just the logistics. It was the symbolism. For decades, the Persico name had carried a kind of myth. The snake in his cell, running the show. His son on the outside, keeping the wheels turning. The feds had shattered that image. Now, both father and son were serving life sentences in separate federal facilities, both stripped of the freedom that gave the mob its edge. For Carmine, the loss was personal. This wasn't just about power or street corners. This was blood. Alley Boy wasn't just his chosen successor. He was his legacy, his chance to prove that the Persico name would endure even after he was gone. Now, that legacy sat behind bars, staring at a future made of cinder block and razor wire. Inside prison walls, Carmine's reputation still commanded respect. But even respect has limits when it can't be enforced. Acting bosses were appointed to keep the machine running, but the shadow of the Cudalo murder hung over every move. Allies were wary. Rivals were watching. The other families, sensing weakness, began pressing harder on shared rackets, pushing boundaries they wouldn't have dared cross a decade earlier. The FBI, smelling blood, doubled down. Wiretaps, surveillance, informants. Every shift in the Colombo hierarchy was monitored, dissected, and filed away for the next indictment. And without Alley Boy's steadying presence on the street, the Persico faction couldn't plug every leak. Small cracks widened. Deals fell apart. Crews began freelancing. Still, there were loyalists who clung to the old ways. Men who believed the Persicos could weather any storm, the way Carmine had survived the commission case, prison sentences, and assassination attempts. But even they couldn't ignore the truth. The Colombo family was bleeding influence. And the blood trail led straight back to that verdict in 2009. The trial had done more than convict Alley Boy. It had given the government something priceless, a blueprint of the Colombo command structure laid bare in open court. Names, titles, responsibilities, all delivered in sworn testimony. It was the kind of roadmap federal prosecutors dream about, and they would use it over and over in the years to come. For the Persicos, the walls were closing in. The question wasn't whether they could hold on to power. It was whether they could survive at all. Somewhere, in a prison cell miles away from his father, Alley Boy sat on his bunk, staring at the concrete wall. Maybe he thought about the day in 1999 when Wild Bill Cudalo climbed into his car, thinking he was heading to a routine meeting. Maybe he thought about the choices that had brought him here, the loyalty to his father, the desire to keep the Persico name feared, the cold calculation that in the mob, survival sometimes means cutting down the very men who once fought beside you. Whatever he thought about, it didn't change the reality. The next generation of the Persico dynasty was now just another inmate in the Bureau of Prisons system. And on the streets of New York, the Colombo family was left scrambling for a new way forward. But the thing about power vacuums in organized crime is that they don't stay empty for long. Someone always steps in. Sometimes it's a loyal soldier trying to hold the line. Sometimes it's an opportunist ready to carve their own empire out of the remains. And as the Persico grip loosened, the quiet maneuvering for control had already begun. The game wasn't over, but the rules had changed. And for the first time in decades, the Persico name no longer guaranteed survival. The gates clanged shut behind him for the last time. Butner Federal Correctional Complex in North Carolina wasn't like the cold, towering prisons Persico had known in New York or Atlanta. It was quieter here, surrounded by pine trees and the soft hum of the southern air. But for Carmine the snake, Persico, no matter how serene the setting looked from the outside, a cage was still a cage, and he knew he would never walk out a free man again. By the time Persico arrived in Butner, he was an old man. Decades of prison life had carved deep lines into his face, and his once quick stride had slowed to something more measured. But in his eyes, the spark remained, that calculating, watchful glint of a man who had outmaneuvered rivals, FBI agents, and even his own underbosses. His sentence, 139 years, hung over him like a lead weight. But Persico wore it with the same stubborn defiance he'd carried since the day he first took the Colombo throne. Butner was known as a prison for the powerful. White-collar criminals, disgraced politicians, corrupt businessmen. And here, in the middle of it all, was one of the last true godfathers. His reputation preceded him. Even among fraudsters and embezzlers, Persico carried an aura. Some inmates treated him like a relic of a vanished era, a living museum piece of Cosa Nostra. Others gave him a wide berth, sensing that even in his 70s, Persico was a man whose enemies had a habit of disappearing. It was here that Persico's path crossed with another infamous inmate, Bernie Madoff, the man whose Ponzi scheme had devoured billions and destroyed thousands of lives. They were an odd pairing on paper. Madoff, the polished Wall Street con man who had spent his life in boardrooms and country clubs. Persico, the street-hardened boss who'd built his empire with blood and fear. Yet, in Butner, they became unlikely associates. To outsiders, it was almost cinematic, the crime boss and the financial fraud king, sitting together in the yard, talking in low tones. But to those who knew them, the alliance made sense. They were both master strategists, both experts at manipulating systems, both men who had once commanded loyalty from armies, whether they wore silk ties or leather jackets. They shared stories, swapped observations about the government's reach, and, on some days, simply sat in companionable silence. Persico's world had shrunk to the rhythms of prison life. The clanging of doors, the shuffle of feet on concrete floors, the ever-present hum of the fluorescent lights. But inside that narrow space, he still held court. Younger inmates, some mobbed up, some just fascinated by the legend, would seek his advice. He was generous with it when he felt like it, dispensing lessons on discipline, loyalty, and the long game. The streets, he told one young inmate, aren't about who's the toughest guy. They're about who's left standing when the smoke clears. But the years were taking their toll. Persico's health began to fail, first in small ways, then in larger ones. Arthritis gnawed at his joints, his eyesight dimmed, and breathing sometimes came with a wheeze that no amount of stubbornness could hide. He developed heart problems, the kind that landed him in the prison hospital wing for days at a time. Yet, even hooked to monitors, Persico kept his composure. To the staff, he was just another aging inmate. To those who knew his history, he was still the snake. A man who never allowed weakness to show. There was a certain irony in it all. For decades, Persico had lived with the constant possibility of a violent death. Gunfire, car bombs, knife fights in dimly lit basements. He'd survived them all. Now, his greatest enemy was time itself, an opponent that moved slowly but with absolute certainty. Still, his mind never stopped working. Through phone calls and carefully coded messages passed via attorneys or visitors, Persico continued to influence the Colombo family's affairs. Not with the iron grip of his younger days, but with the measured, strategic touch of a man who knew when to move and when to wait. Acting bosses came and went, but the family's heartbeat still echoed faintly in Butner's quiet halls. To the outside world, the Mafia of the 21st century was a shadow of what it had been. But inside Persico's head, the rules hadn't changed. Alliances mattered. Money mattered. Respect mattered. And above all, the name mattered. The Persico name. Even in a federal prison hundreds of miles from the streets of Brooklyn, Carmine guarded it like a crown jewel. Occasionally, reporters would send requests for interviews. He turned them down. Carmine wasn't interested in being someone's headline or nostalgic feature piece. He had lived by omerta, the code of silence, too long to break it now. What he shared stayed within the walls, among those who understood the language of the life. Madoff, for his part, often seemed more open, more willing to talk about the mechanics of his downfall. Persico listened. Sometimes he'd offer an observation, a sharp comment that cut through the self-justifications. If Madoff was the architect of a house of cards, Persico was the man who knew exactly how to topple it without leaving fingerprints. The two men became a strange fixture in Butner, the Wall Street swindler and the Mafia boss, walking slow laps in the yard. In those walks, Persico seemed to find a kind of rhythm, a way to keep moving despite the walls closing in. Prison gossip said they even played cards together, though whether for stakes or just for the mental exercise, no one could say for sure. But as the years rolled on, Persico's health worsened. There were whispers about cancer, about surgeries that left him weaker each time. His once strong frame thinned, his movements slowed further. Yet he refused to complain. Complaining was for men who had already accepted defeat. Persico, even with death pressing closer, never gave the government, or his enemies, the satisfaction of seeing him broken. By 2018, it was clear his time was running out. The trips to the medical wing grew more frequent. He spent less time in the yard, more time in his cell, resting. Visitors noticed the change, the dimmer light in his eyes, the pauses in conversation where once his mind had been razor-sharp. And yet, even in those final months, Persico still found ways to make his presence felt. A phone call to a loyal captain, a word of approval passed through a visitor, a subtle reminder to the world that the snake was still alive, still watching. The end came in March of 2019. Carmine Persico died at the age of 85 in the prison's medical center. The official cause was complications from diabetes, but those who knew him said it was simply time catching up to a man who had spent more than half his life behind bars. News of his death rippled through New York's underworld and beyond. Old rivals and allies alike paused to consider what his passing meant. For some, it marked the end of an era, the death of the last of the commission bosses who had once ruled the city's 5 families with quiet authority and violent resolve. For others, it was just another reminder that in the end, the life always ends the same way, in a cell or in the ground. But inside Butner, for a few days, the absence was palpable. The yard felt quieter. The old table where Persico sometimes sat with Madoff stayed empty. Men who had once nodded respectfully as they passed now walked by without looking, perhaps uneasy at the sight of a legend reduced to memory. And somewhere in the tangled web of the Colombo family's fractured power structure, the real question lingered. Without Carmine's shadow looming over every decision, what would become of the family he had fought so hard to control? The answer, as always in the life, would depend on who moved fastest and who struck first. The night before he died, the air in Butner Federal Medical Center felt still. Too still. Inmates shuffled through the dimly lit corridors, their voices low, their faces tired. Somewhere in the medical wing, behind a heavy steel door and a row of buzzing fluorescent lights, Carmine the Snake Persico lay in his bed. He was 85 years old. His body, once wiry and sharp, was frail now. Diabetes had worn him down, heart troubles had slowed him, and time, the one enemy he could never outwit, was finally at the table, ready to collect. The guards who walked past his room knew who he was. Some only from his file, others from decades of whispered legend. The last of the old-school commission bosses. A man who had once controlled an empire of fear from a prison cell hundreds of miles from New York. Even now, weakened and fading, there was an undeniable presence in the room. Carmine's eyes might have been dim, but they still watched you like they were reading your next 3 moves. For more than 30 years, Persico had lived behind bars. He had seen prison riots, transfers, lockdowns, and the slow erosion of his own health. But he had never bent, never begged, never handed the government a confession it could hang on the wall. His enemies had waited for the day he'd be carried out of prison in chains or in disgrace. Instead, it would be in silence. The news of his failing health had traveled quietly among certain circles. On the outside, a few loyalists in the Colombo family knew. They sent their well wishes in coded messages, knowing full well that the man they called the Snake might never hear them. On the inside, some inmates kept their distance, uneasy about being too close to a man whose name still commanded attention in law enforcement files. Others, especially the younger ones, walked by slowly, stealing glances at the legend who had somehow kept his hand in the game until the very end. That night, the medical staff checked on him often. His breathing was shallow. The monitors beeped in a slow, uneven rhythm. Somewhere deep in the recesses of his mind, Persico might have remembered the noise of the streets of Brooklyn, the clinking of glasses in smoky back rooms, the low murmur of men talking business, the distant wail of a siren. But here, all he could hear was the hum of the air vents and the occasional squeak of rubber soles on the floor. Persico had never imagined himself dying like this. For years, he'd assumed the life would take him in a blaze, a hail of bullets, a car bomb, an ambush in the street. That was how most men in his world went. Quick, brutal, unceremonious. Instead, time had dealt him something different, a slow fade, surrounded not by soldiers and capos, but by nurses and correctional officers. In those last hours, he spoke little. He didn't waste words on sentiment. If there was regret, he didn't show it. That wasn't his way. He had made his choices, built his life from them, and paid for them, in blood, in years, in freedom. Somewhere in the balance, he might have believed the score was even. When the end came on March 13, 2019, it came quietly. No struggle, no final curse, just the steady slowing of breath, and then nothing. The monitors flatlined. The staff confirmed what they already knew. Carmine Persico, boss of the Colombo family, inmate number unknown to the streets, but etched forever in the FBI's memory, was gone. The news traveled fast, even in prison. Within hours, men in the yard were whispering. Inmates with no connection to the Mafia still nodded in quiet recognition. The guards exchanged glances. Out in New York, phones buzzed. Old associates, some still in the life, others long retired, felt the gravity of it. The last of the commission bosses, the man who had survived war after war, was dead. For law enforcement veterans, it was the closing of a file that had been open for decades. They remembered the commission case, the headlines, the courtroom stares. Some of them had chased him in his fugitive days. Some had listened to his voice on wiretaps, cold and deliberate as he gave orders from a cell. Now, all they had left was paperwork and the knowledge that one of their most notorious targets had died exactly where they had wanted him, in federal custody. But for the Colombo family, the loss was more complicated. Persico had been the center of gravity for so long that even in prison, his word had weight. His death left a void no one could truly fill. In the underworld, power abhors a vacuum. Already, there were murmurs of shifting alliances, of men positioning themselves to take advantage of the absence. In Bensonhurst, Bay Ridge, and Howard Beach, the older generation talked quietly about the old days. They spoke of Carmine as the last of a breed, the bosses who had lived through the great wars of the families, who had kept their people in line with both fear and loyalty. The younger ones only knew him as a legend, a name in stories told late at night over glasses of red wine. But as the news reached certain hands, there was no mourning. To the families of those murdered under Persico's reign, to the witnesses who had lived in fear for decades, to the lawmen who had buried their own, his death was not a loss. It was a closing chapter, a final period at the end of a long, bloody sentence. In Butner, his body was prepared without ceremony. No silk suit, no gold watch, just the plain, standard issue of a federal inmate. Outside the gates, arrangements began for his remains to be transported back to New York. Even in death, his journey home would be under the watchful eyes of federal transport officers. His funeral, when it came, was small by the standards of the old Mafia send-offs. There were no massive processions, no lines of limousines snaking through the streets. Law enforcement cameras were everywhere, capturing the faces of anyone who came to pay respects. The casket was closed. The eulogies were brief. And yet, for those inside the small circle, the weight of his absence was heavy. Somewhere in Brooklyn, an old associate leaned back in his chair and lit a cigarette. "The snake's gone," he murmured, almost to himself. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about the wars or the prison years. He was thinking about a young Carmine on the streets in the 1950s, sharp as a blade, already carving out a piece of the city for himself. History will remember Carmine Persico in different ways. To some, he was a ruthless crime boss who left behind a trail of bodies and broken lives. To others, he was a cunning strategist, a survivor in a world where most didn't live long enough to see 50. He was both and more. A man shaped by the streets, defined by the life, and ultimately consumed by it. Back in Butner, life went on. New inmates arrived. Old ones were transferred out. The yard filled again with chatter and movement. But for those who had known Carmine, there was a subtle shift, a space where his presence used to be. And somewhere, in the tangled, ever-shifting politics of the Colombo family, the question burned hotter than ever. Without the snake watching from the shadows, who would strike first and who would fall next? The night Carmine Persico was lowered into the ground, there was no thunderclap, no sudden shift in the air over New York. The city went on as it always did. Traffic lights changed, subway doors hissed open and shut, and somewhere in Little Italy a waiter popped the cork on a bottle of Chianti. But in the corners where the underworld still breathed, men looked at one another and silently acknowledged the same truth. The Colombo family's era as a true power in the Mafia had ended. For decades, even from behind bars, Persico had been the spine of the family. His word carried the weight of law. He had played factions like a chess master, moving pawns and rooks with patience, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Now, the board was empty of its most dangerous player, and the pieces, they were scattered. In the days after his death, there were quiet gatherings, no big sit-downs, no show of force. The old guard, what was left of them, spoke in low voices about the glory years, about the wars, about the coups. But their words carried more nostalgia than strategy. The Colombo family, once one of the most feared of New York's 5 families, had been reduced to a shadow. The organization's reach was shorter, its soldiers fewer, its enemies bolder. Law enforcement could see it in the numbers. Surveillance reports showed that street-level operations, loan sharking, gambling, construction rackets, were smaller, less organized. The younger generation of mobsters had no memory of the old wars, no understanding of why the Persico name had once been untouchable. They moved differently, talked differently. Some were more interested in fast money than in building a lasting criminal empire. And the other families? They saw the cracks. The Gambinos, with their deep connections and quiet resurgence, began circling in areas that had once been Colombo turf. The Genovese, careful and calculating as always, tested boundaries without making noise. The Lucchese's and Bananos, each with their own troubles, knew they were dealing with a wounded animal, dangerous, but weakened. Inside what remained of the Colombo hierarchy, the talk turned to leadership. Without Persico, there was no single figure who could command absolute loyalty. Andrew Russo had been a stabilizing force at times, but he was aging and tired. Alphonse "Ali Boy" Persico, Carmine's son, was already buried in his own prison sentence. The rest of the captains were either too old to lead or too mistrusted by their peers. Every name that came up in whispers came with a problem attached. The FBI, never shy about pouring gasoline on the embers of suspicion, quietly let it be known that they were watching. Agents speculated that the family might fracture entirely, absorbed piece by piece into the other 4. In the press, journalists framed it as the end of an era, writing that the Colombo family had become the weakest of the 5. The words stung, not just because they were true, but because they were public. On the streets, soldiers still collected payments, still ran their small rackets, still showed up at wakes and weddings in sharp suits. But the intimidation factor, the thing that had once made a Colombo soldier's mere presence a warning, had faded. It's like when a shark stops moving, the aura changes, the prey senses something is off. People who once paid without a word started asking questions, pushing back, or going elsewhere for protection. In Brooklyn, one old-timer summed it up best over a cup of coffee. Without Carmine, we're a boat without a rudder. The waves are going to take us wherever they want. It wasn't just about leadership, it was about the myth. For years, the Colombo family's survival had been tied to the legend of the snake. Now that legend was gone, and legends, once gone, don't come back. The city itself had changed too. The neighborhoods that once served as breeding grounds for soldiers had shifted, their Italian enclaves thinned out, their storefront social clubs turned into coffee bars or yoga studios. Surveillance photos of mob haunts now showed tourists with cameras, not made men playing cards. It was harder to blend in, harder to disappear into the noise of the street. Still, there were those who refused to let the family fade quietly. A handful of loyalists talked about regrouping, about honoring Persico's vision. They spoke of discipline, of bringing in younger men who could be trained in the old ways. But the world they were talking about didn't exist anymore. RICO laws had tightened the screws, and the government was quicker to flip low-level guys than ever before. The code of silence was no longer a given. Fear alone couldn't hold a family together. Even among the few true believers, suspicion ran deep. Without Persico to referee disputes, old grudges resurfaced. Captains eyed each other's rackets, wondering if they could make a move without triggering another war. Nobody wanted a repeat of the bloodshed that had nearly destroyed the family in the early 90s. But in the Mafia, peace without power is just another kind of death. The FBI kept its ears open, but what they heard most was absence. No big meetings. No major money moves. Just the steady hum of an organization existing, but not thriving. An aging body still walking, but without the fire in its chest. Agents debated whether it was only a matter of time before the Columbos became a name in the history books rather than a player on the board. And yet, in some dimly lit backroom, a conversation might still spark. A young man with ambition might still dream of bringing the family back. An old capo might decide to make one last grab for the top. In that world, power has a way of resurrecting itself, if only for a moment. All it takes is the right combination of greed, opportunity, and desperation. For now, though, the Colombo family moves like a shadow, present, but diminished. Its soldiers keep their heads down, its captains measure every move, and its reputation lingers like the fading echo of a gunshot in an empty street. The snake is gone, and without him, the hunt for survival has only just begun. They called him the Snake, and not just because of his knack for slipping through indictments or sidestepping bullets. It was for the way he moved in the underworld, silent when he needed to be, striking only when the odds were in his favor, and leaving nothing but damage in his wake. Carmine Persico's story isn't just the tale of a mob boss. It's the anatomy of a man who made cunning into a weapon more dangerous than any gun. When you talk to the old-timers, they don't speak of Persico like they do other bosses. With others, they'll tell you about power, muscle, money. With Persico, they talk about the mind, the way he could sit in a room, let everyone else talk, and then cut straight through the noise with a decision that would shift the balance of power. He was the rare figure who could be both charming and terrifying in the same conversation. If you were useful to him, he'd treat you like a trusted son. If you crossed him, you'd find out just how cold a man could be without ever raising his voice. From the time he was a teenager running the streets of Brooklyn, Persico played the long game. He understood that in the Mafia, brute force gets you quick wins, but brains keep you in the game. He didn't need to be the loudest guy in the room. He just needed to be the one pulling the strings. Even his enemies admitted it. Carmine wasn't lucky. He was calculated. Every move had layers. That reputation only grew as the years went on. In the early days, when other men were making their bones with flashy hits and headline-grabbing scores, Persico was cultivating loyalty in quiet ways. Small favors here, a word in the right ear there. He knew that control didn't come from fear alone. It came from having people believe that their future was tied to yours, that without you, their world would collapse. It was that subtlety that made him dangerous. The commission case of the mid-'80s, which saw the heads of New York's 5 families indicted, could have ended his career outright. Instead, even from a cell, Persico stayed in command, issuing orders through acting bosses and trusted captains. It was the kind of control most bosses lose the second the cell door slams shut. But for Persico, prison was just another battlefield, one with different rules, but rules he could still manipulate. Carmine's reign wasn't without blood. The Colombo family, under his leadership, saw some of the most violent internal wars in mob history. Allies became enemies overnight. Streets ran hot with vendettas that stretched on for years. Yet even in chaos, Persico kept a tight grip. He was like a general who could fight a war on 3 fronts and still find time to map out the next campaign. To law enforcement, Persico was a nightmare. He was never just a gangster they could corner and charge. He was an opponent who could anticipate their moves like a chess master reading the board. Agents and prosecutors learned the hard way that every conversation with Persico had traps in it. Even his guilty pleas were calculated, a way to cut losses while positioning himself for the next play. But perhaps what defined him most was his refusal to surrender power. Most bosses, once they're locked up for life, either hand the reins over or see them taken by force. Persico didn't just hold on. He restructured his family from the inside, using surrogates to enforce his will. To the men on the street, Carmine wasn't a boss emeritus. He was still the boss. Even decades into his sentence, captains deferred to him, and soldiers spoke his name with the same respect and fear they had in the 70s. The irony was that his greatest strength, his ability to keep control, was also what kept the Colombo family in constant conflict. That iron grip meant there was never a clean transition, never a chance for a new leader to unify the family without Persico's blessing. It created a cycle of proxy wars and grudges that outlived him. But from his perspective, letting go would have been worse than dying. His nickname, the Snake, came to symbolize more than his early betrayals or his survival instinct. It became shorthand for the way he could twist a situation until it worked in his favor, no matter how bad the odds looked. Rivals hated it. Friends respected it. The streets whispered it. In the end, it was less a nickname and more a brand, one that marked him as one of the most cunning figures the American Mafia had ever seen. Even outside of the mob world, Persico's legend lingered. True crime authors wrote about him as if he were a character from a crime novel, the self-taught lawyer who defended himself in court against the full weight of the federal government, the prisoner who ruled like a king from inside a fortress of concrete and steel. Hollywood circled his story more than once, drawn to the paradox of a man who could be both ruthless and methodical, violent and sophisticated. And yet, for all the headlines and myths, the truth about Carmine Persico is harder to pin down. Was he a brilliant strategist who kept his family alive against impossible odds? Or was he a stubborn relic who couldn't see that his grip was strangling the very thing he'd built? Depending on who you ask, you'll get both answers, sometimes from the same person in the same breath. What's undeniable is that Persico's reign reshaped the Colombo family forever. He proved that in organized crime, intelligence could be just as lethal as muscle. He showed that power could be maintained through whispers as effectively as through gunfire. And he left behind a legacy that even his enemies couldn't erase, the image of a boss who outthought, outmaneuvered, and outlasted nearly everyone who stood against him. In the end, Persico's story is a reminder of a brutal truth about the Mafia. The most dangerous man in the room isn't always the one holding the gun. Sometimes, it's the one sitting quietly at the table, letting you talk, while he decides your fate without saying a word. And for half a century, in courtrooms, prison yards, and the backrooms of Brooklyn, that man was Carmine, the Snake, Persico. But legacies don't die with the man. Somewhere, in a quiet corner of the city, there are still those who claim to have known his mind, still those who carry out small acts in his name. The question is whether those embers can ignite into something larger, or whether the legend of the Snake will be the last thing the Colombo family ever truly controls.